Hello, and welcome everyone to the third and final day of the Parks Accessibility Conference. My name is Allison, and I will be your host for today. I am a 35-year-old female with short, light brown hair, and today I'm wearing glasses, a lavender top, and a white cardigan. Just a reminder that live streams are available on our YouTube channel. If seeing both ASL and LSQ is overstimulating, please use the links in the chat to access the English or French YouTube streams where the view has been adjusted. Today's theme is Innovative Solutions to Improve Park Accessibility. While this conference is virtual in nature and we have speakers and attendees from across Canada and internationally, the Parks Accessibility Research and Conference team acknowledge that the land on which this conference is hosted is the traditional sacred territory of many First Nation civilizations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Three Fires, Confederacy peoples, the Haudenosaunee, Six Nations, Confederacy peoples, and the ancient Wendat peoples. The territory, which we refer to as Toronto, is ceded land covered under Treaty 13 between the Mississauga of the Credit Nation and the Crown. The sacred custodianship of these lands comes from the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and Covenant between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee established way before contact with settlers. Today, this land is now home to many, including the First Nations people, as well as Métis and Inuit peoples. As settlers and visitors on this territory, we strive in our service to understand our responsibilities and purpose as custodians and caretakers of these sacred lands. At the same time, we strive to reconcile and understand these Indigenous civilizations who continue to be impacted by the ongoing process of colonialism. We invite all conference speakers and attendees to take a brief moment of self-reflection to contemplate your relationship with the land where you reside. As you attend this conference, let us pay respects to the Indigenous peoples that inhabited these sacred lands way before you and we arrived. And let us today pay our respects to the original caretakers of these sacred lands. Some housekeeping. We invite attendees to submit questions using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screens. Questions can also be submitted by telephone by calling 416-597-3422, extension 7879. Questions can also be submitted by email to engineeringhealth@uhn.ca. We have a tight schedule to stick to, but we will try to answer all questions, time permitting. If you require French captions, those will be displayed on a separate screen. Please see the links in the chat box. And if you are accessing the conference audio using the telephone line, you will only be able to hear the conference in the original language each speaker is using. If you run into any technical difficulties accessing the conference, please email engineeringhealth@uhn.ca or call 416-597-3422, extension 7879. Just a reminder that we have a fully accessible virtual goodie bag available on our website. The items featured in the goodie bag are from various disability-focused and run Canadian companies and disabled artists. We are grateful and honored to feature these items at our conference. Our first keynote speaker today is Mahadeo Sukai. Mahadeo is Canada's first blind biomedical research scientist with more than 20 years' experience as an academic researcher and educator. He is a key member of the Canadian National Institute of the Blind, where he serves as Chief Accessibility Officer, Principal Investigator for numerous research projects, and oversees their international affairs work. Mahadeo was not able to attend live today as he and his wife recently welcomed a new baby, but he was kind enough to submit a recorded talk for our conference today. Welcome, Mahadeo.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be here with you, even if only virtually. I love tea. It's one of my two vices. Books are the other. Drinking tea with a good book, that's pure bliss. In pre-pandemic times, my wife and I would often visit a few favorite coffee places in Kingston where we live. Life has changed, of course, with the pandemic and will change more as I'm speaking with you via pre-recorded session as my wife and I are expecting our first child the week of the conference. I have a hard time with coffee and tea shops generally. It's because of the selection process, not because I have a hard time making decisions. Most of the time I don't. Rather, I have a hard time reading the menus. The writing is too small. They're too far away. Usually the contrast is poor and there's a spotlight hitting the menu board at an awkward angle, causing ill-placed reflections or glare. And also because I never think to take my trusty monocular telescope with me to a purely social setting, and the distance and angle are too great for me to catch a clean magnified photo on my phone, even with one of the best iPhone cameras there is. I typically defer to my wife, having her go first and artfully creating more time for me to figure stuff out, or she'd read likely options out to me. If I were by myself or meeting a colleague, I'd have to employ different tactics. I'll tell you about the 3 places we visited most frequently. The first of these is a wonderful place to visit with a large selection of teas. In theory, I've discovered that not everything is available all the time, and their menu is best read online, except when they don't have something I want. In the first coffee shop, I'd usually ask the barista for options and have them read out the menu choices because they didn't have a handy menu to read on the spot, and their app had entirely too many options to do this quickly. In coffee shop number 2, the barista would helpfully point me to a very convenient menu with decent print that I could pluck from a stand next to the cashier and peruse quickly. In coffee shop number 3, they used to let me behind the counter to have a multi-sensory experience with the teas by exploring the little boxes of tea up close. 2.5 years on from the first pandemic lockdowns, they don't do this anymore, unfortunately. They've defaulted to the same strategy employed by coffee shop number 1, except without the inconveniently placed spotlights. Interestingly, coffee shop number 1 is part of a large chain with locations on almost every street corner, it feels like. Coffee shop number 2 is less ubiquitous and somewhat more classy. Coffee shop number 3 is a specialty coffee place and not part of a chain at all. Also notably, in pandemic times, it's possible to do delivery only from coffee shop number 1, not from number 2 or number 3. I want you to pay close attention to how I set the story up. I've presented the barriers that I encounter in reading menu boards and have tried to do so in descriptive ways that get at the functional issues those barriers represent, and more, have offered potential solutions to those barriers in my wording of them. I've also presented some of my more common solution finding techniques and explained that they're not always effective. At no point have I said to you that I have a seeing disability, and at no point did I tell you the diagnosis of what that was. But of course, that's a bit of a conceit. If you've read my bio or you look me up online, you know fully well that I do live with a seeing disability and that I've done so all my life. We often have a great trouble separating the terms diversity, accessibility, and inclusion from one another. We think that diversity, a representational term, is synonymous with the other two, and often we attempt to demonstrate our inclusiveness as a nation, a community, a business, or a team by pointing to our diversity. Confusion between accessibility and inclusion can be epic. They're often thought to mean exactly the same thing, but for two supposedly distinct, non-overlapping populations. Accessibility, in gigantic air quotes, is often reserved for and claimed by the communities of persons with disabilities. Inclusion, also in gigantic air quotes, is associated with the full participation of other diverse groups, be it ethnic diversity, gender diversity, religious diversity, diversity of sexual orientation, language diversity, and so on. There is a problem with that line of thinking, however. Yes, it's true that I live with a seeing disability and have done so all my life, but it is also true that I'm a South Asian Caribbean descended first-generation immigrant male who is married and lives in a double-income household. Realistically, I cannot, and shouldn't be expected to, separate those identities from one another. Let's come back to the tale of the three coffee shops. Coffee shop number 1 represents diversity at its finest, a glorious selection of teas. Coffee shop number 2 represents accessibility. Menus online, on the menu board behind the counter, and in print, and all teas available all the time. And coffee shop number 3 represents inclusion. My agency of choice is empowered since I get to interact with the teas on my own terms without need for assistance by going behind the counter. This story is illustrative of a few things about how we as a society think and talk about disability, accessibility, and inclusion, not just the persons with disabilities, but for everyone. We may argue that all three coffee shops were accessible to me as a person with a seeing disability. However, they were not all accessible in quite the same way, and I would argue that some were more accessible and inclusive than others, and one was, pre-pandemic, most inclusive of all. First, coffee shop number one is emblematic of how we're taught to think about accessibility and how most of us do so. There's a process or environment in place. Someone needs assistance, they have to request it. We get to look puzzled that someone needs assistance for such an obvious thing. Sometimes we say something insulting and stupid, like, can't you read the menu? It's back there. But because outcomes matter and we don't want to lose a customer, especially if the manager is watching us, we ultimately go right ahead and offer the assistance requested. Coffee shop number one is also illustrative of an important distinction between something being accessible and something being usable. They have an online menu accessible to me on my phone, but what good is the menu if items on it are not available and there's no notice of that? It's not very usable then, is it? Those of us who work in the accessibility and inclusion space often have to be careful not to confuse these things. And when we design something, we need to make sure it is both accessible to all individuals and usable by them. Coffee shop number two presents their menus in multiple formats, recognizing that maybe the menu board isn't all that accessible, and so they give us at least two ways to parse the information in store. Three, technically, because they absolutely would answer questions if asked. They would also recognize up front that for many reasons, someone may not want to or be able to read a menu board. Arguably, coffee shop number two isn't just emblematic of accessibility, it is also emblematic of elements of inclusion, which is distinct enough concept that it's worth calling out. As coffee shop number one illustrates, one can be accessible but not necessarily inclusive unless you're stretching that definition of inclusion. Coffee shop number three offered a multi-sensory experience. Not only would they respond to questions and have a decent-sized print menu for perusal, but I could also take in information by smell and touch. Pre-pandemic, they offered a set of means by which just about anyone could absorb the information needed to make a decision, which is about as good an operating definition of universal design as I've ever come across, and had more elements of inclusion than coffee shop number two. Before the pandemic, if I had a choice, I'd have chosen coffee shop number three hands down, and in fact was a frequent visitor and gave them a lot of my business. Coffee shop number three is illustrative, unfortunately, of what has happened in society as a result of the pandemic. Inclusion and universal design have been downplayed or sacrificed in favor of health and safety, and many places default to the example set by coffee shop number one. And unfortunately, in many instances, not even that. This, in my mind, reinforces a false tension between accessibility, inclusion, and universal design, and the public good. How this plays out over the next few years as we learn to live with COVID-19 and as we prepare for whatever is next isn't just something to watch. In my perspective, it's something we all have to take an active role in shaping. Coffee shops number two and three, pre-pandemic, were also great examples of accessibility by design, in air quotes. Effectively, proactively thinking about solutions that would benefit persons with disabilities and implementing them up front without having to be asked. This is in contradistinction to the accessibility by response approach, where solutions are implemented upon request. Accessibility by design recognizes that solutions for persons with disabilities are at worst value neutral, as well as not obvious for others. At best, solutions implemented in accessibility by design approaches are themselves beneficial for all persons, not just for persons who live with disabilities. By contrast, the reactive accessibility by response approach invites special solutions, in air quotes, customized to the individual making the request. We know accessibility by response by another name, personalized accommodations, and it is in fact the basis of how we think about accessibility in society, enshrined in human rights codes and cases, and built right into the framework of legislation such as the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. We take a person-centered approach where the individual who has the defined need asks, and in asking, describes what would work for them. There's a reason we do this, and it's because historically persons with disabilities had decisions and choices made for us, often with devastatingly negative consequences. Accessibility by design, an avenue of systemic change, sometimes naively resembles this old parental approach, which is unfortunate, particularly when we think of policies, practice, and processes and how they are currently developed and implemented. And so we live in a world where I have to tell you that I have difficulty seeing in order for us to find accessibility solutions. We often think about accessibility as something done on demand. Personalized application of resources or just-in-time thinking has allowed us as a society to fall into a dangerous trap of waiting until somebody asks for something in order to do it. Think about personalized medicine in cancer for a moment. This used to be my field, so I can speak with some authority. The right treatment at the right time, at the right dose for the right person doesn't mean a scramble to find the drug the patient needs. It means being prepared to provide that drug to the patient when it is determined that's what they need, for example, through genetic testing. Or consider most elevators today. They have braille signage, embossed letters and numbers on buttons, and usually audio enabled. As someone with a seeing disability, I can confidently go into an elevator in a newer building and use it without too much kerfuffle. 50 years ago, I'd have needed help. The former is an example of proactive design thinking employed as an environmental solution. We have prepared so that an accessibility solution is there when needed, and this is another way to think about accessibility by design. The latter is an example of reactive thinking or accessibility by response. A solution, someone to assist in using the elevator, is created when requested. You can argue with me and say that a dedicated elevator person for an inaccessible elevator is still an environmental solution and an example of proactive thinking. And you're right, up to a point. What happens if that dedicated elevator person also has a disability? And again, what about my agency in being able to choose the floor I wish to go to on my own? Accessibility by design gets us into the realm of universal design, designing and implementing solutions that work for the greatest number, the greatest fraction of the time, or what Coffee Shop Number 3 did before the pandemic. This often gets mistaken for solutions that work for the greatest number with minimum effort. Think the 80-20 rule, which depends on a logical and statistical fallacy, that there is such a thing as an average human being. I'm a biological data sciences person by training and by vocation. I'm going to cheerfully tell you that there is no such thing as an average human being, not genotypically, not phenotypically, and not by lived experience. Universal design also gets horribly misunderstood as leveling the playing field. If we stick with metaphorical meadows for a moment, I want you to consider that universal design is the equivalent of feeding that meadow Miracle-Gro so that all blades of grass grow to the same height. Universal design is not mowing the meadow. In designing any interaction between a person and their surroundings, we need to take three things into account: the environment that we're in, the information we're interacting with, and the people around us who we also interact with. The tale of three coffee shops that I started with is illustrative in this way as well. Coffee shop number 1 is a paragon of environmental universal design. Like I said in the beginning, it's a wonderful place to visit. But so too were the other two coffee shops. Coffee shop number 2 did accessibility of information really well by picking up at least some of the principles of universal design for learning. The staff of coffee shop number 3, however, intuitively or consciously understood the principles of universal design, of social interaction, and the importance of flexibility, creativity, collaboration, and openness in interacting with their clients. At its very this model of universal design of social interaction requires us to put ourselves in the perspective of the other person: customer service agent to customer, service provider to client, healthcare practitioner to patient, teacher to student, employer to employee, and peer to peer. In that empathic perspective, the model asks us to consider the purposes of an interaction between us as humans and whether that core purpose is best served by rigorous applications of the policies we are often surrounded by. For coffee shop number 3, the ability for a customer to go behind the counter and interact with the tea doesn't invalidate the staff-customer relationship and encourage both one-time sale and long-term loyalty of this customer. Because now I know I'm not dependent on anyone, customer service agent or companion, to help me with that choice and purchase. My agency, my independence, and my empowerment as a human being were all preserved. The outcomes and impact of this approach are astonishingly easy to measure in the context of business, employment, education, healthcare. I could go on. We can directly measure reputational impact, impact on client satisfaction, outcomes and loyalty on service provision and on our staff, just to name a few. I'd like to offer a way of thinking about accessibility, a model, if you will, for us to follow as teams, organizations, and agencies in the world. We can imagine a stage 0 organization that has not begun to conceive of accessibility and inclusion in its work, staff, and activities. A stage 1 organization applies personalized accommodations on an ad hoc basis, while a stage 2 organization systematizes that approach via policy and practice, in effect, attempting an accessibility by design approach rooted in accessibility by response. A stage 3 organization begins to conceive of true accessibility by design by creating policies and practices that proactively strive for inclusion through implementing accessibility solutions. A stage 4 organization aims for universal design and environmental solutions, and a stage 5 organization applies principles of continual improvement to what a stage 4 organization does. When we think about these concepts in the context of the pandemic, we begin to envision the long-term ramifications of the past 2.5 years on accessibility in our society. A steady movement towards stages 3, 4, and 5 has been hopefully temporarily halted in favor of approaches more reminiscent of stages 0, 1, and 2. Couple this with the isolation, lack of mobility, and barriers to service faced by us as persons with disabilities during the pandemic, and we have an incipient, yet often hidden, accessibility crisis in society. Conferences and discussions like this offer some hope for the future. Communities coming together, recognizing our biases, being inclusive of us as persons with disabilities, and working to design solutions in our unique spaces and places, in effect, building a network of commitment and expertise, facilitate change, a renewed sense of optimism and progress. Thank you for listening, and I wish you excellent discussions.
Thank you, Mahadeo, for allowing us to share your words at our conference today. We'll just take a few seconds to swap out our interpreters. Our second keynote speaker today is Mike Prescott. Mike is a postdoctoral researcher at Laval University in geomatics and works with Simon Fraser University's gerontology department. Mike has over 35 years of academic, professional, and lived experience in the areas of disability, mobility, accessibility, and inclusion in cities, parks, sports, recreation, and tourism. His current project, Parcours, seeks to inform accessibility standards in national parks. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Allison. On my first slide here, I have a picture of this idyllic park that has people and their dogs moving around, enjoying the scenery. And this is kind of one of the things that I think about when I think about parks. But what we just heard, I think, is a perfect preview to what I'm hoping to discuss here. So next slide. So here you can see a picture of myself in my manual wheelchair with the great dog Gabby the Burner, as well as logos for the universities and organizations that I'm involved with, including Accessibility Standards Canada, that helped to fund the project that I will be focusing on talking about today as it relates to parks. About me, I think Allison covered a lot of that. One of the things that I am just recently started was a position as the project manager for the Accessible Organizations Project, which is to help organizations in BC develop committees and accessibility plans based on the recent legislation here. So as a person, and I'd really like to thank Tilak and his team for inviting me to this opportunity, and to hopefully we're sharing knowledge and continuing to grow the accessibility movement. I think a lot of the things I might be talking about have already been said or will be said by many of the individuals that I've had the pleasure of working with in the past and hopefully working with in the future. So today, as I said, I'm here to discuss really the results of a study that was funded by Accessibility Standards Canada that focuses on informing national park standards. In particular, I want to introduce a model for strategically approaching the design and management of parks to serve all visitors, called the Journey Experience Mapping Model for Accessibility, or GEMA. And I think, again, it's a nice extension of what was just talked about in the previous presentation. Next slide. So I think one of the things that is often, you start off with asking is, why do parks need to be accessible? And here we have a slide that has a picture of a group of older adults and some in wheelchairs listening to a park interpretation presentation. And I think this audience doesn't need to be sold on the idea that, there's so many benefits, whether they're physical, social, health, or mental benefits for individuals, but also economic benefits for society. And in the end, it's really building on an equity principle. Next slide. So, how can we make parks enjoyable for everyone? And I think what was just said is not just about accessibility and inclusion. It's how am I actually going to get the enjoyment that I want out of a park? Because that's really why we go to parks. So the first thing that we needed to do is next. Back. This slide, I guess the builds don't work. Okay, so what we want to start with is being able to identify challenges. And then as we go through this learning process, map out these challenges to take into consideration what's important and what's difficult to implement. Again, this is through a learning process. You can start to identify challenges that you've prioritized. And I think that's one of the key things to consider, is that we may have this long list of these are the things that we need to do, but we really need to be able to prioritize this, because there are going to be challenges from those that are providing those environments and those services. And if we can guide them with, here's what we really think is important to start with, then we can get moving on our strategy more effectively. And this just feeds this loop of this learning loop, and based on the interaction that we have, the organizations have with the disability community, in particular, if the people with disabilities are members of those organizations. And today I'm trying to look at that through this lens that I call GEMA, which builds on this idea of where we had study participants talk about exactly what I just said. What's important to you? How do you sort of cluster those the challenges that you find moving around in parks, and how can we look at that through that prism? So what we found is that there's a preparation stage, a planning stage, and a enjoyment stage where you're actually visiting the park. Next. So in this slide, what you can see on the right is a web page for our study. And in this picture, there's research assistants asking me questions on a beach mat in Boundary Bay in Richmond, BC. So in our project, we are going with participants to a diversity of parks in the area around Vancouver, with people with a wide variety of disabilities. And we take them through the parks, we film their interactions and asking them questions about, what is it that they like about the park, what could be changed, and really trying to get an idea of, again, not only what works from an accessibility or inclusion component, but what's really important to them for enjoying it. And I often think of accessibility as similar to a game where you have a referee. If I don't, a good referee is somebody that you don't even notice during a game. A park experience is a great park experience is one where you don't actually notice the accessibility. So what we found from this research, the initial findings at least, is that there is definitely a complex and interdependent set of challenges that impact how the experience is of visiting a park. And again, there's environmental, there's social, there's temporal, information, which I think a lot of the speakers have already spoken about a lot, and personal factors. So we can't dismiss those. And this has sort of cumulatively led to this idea of this GEMA model. Next. So in this model, what we have is at the top, we've got 3 boxes that are connected by arrows, and they're labeled prepare, plan, and enjoy. And our research found that there were these 3 clusters of activities that define the journey experience. So going back to our previous presenter, it's kind of the idea of how do we understand that experience through the eyes of people with a wide range of disabilities, so that you can design and create and manage parks that are for everybody, not just even people with disabilities. So in step 1, the focus that was found was about, am I even prepared to go to the park physically and mentally? Is my mobility device in a proper working order? And maybe what do I need to wear? In step 2, we're looking at, what are my plans for actually getting to the park, and what am I going to do once I'm there? So you need to know where you want to go, how I'm going to get there, what are the challenges that I'm going to face moving around the park and interacting with different features, and what are my expectations? Because that's often a critical element at the end, is did my experience meet what my expectations were? And things like information are great ways of setting those expectations. And in step 3 is, will I enjoy the visit? So what will the experience be like at the destination? What obstacles and hazards might I face? And ultimately, will I enjoy that visit? And we found that there were really these 4 clusters of environmental factors that affected each of these steps. And they were around, and they kind of relate. The way the boxes on the bottom are set up is that whatever is above them in terms of the process, so weather is right below prepare, obstacles and hazards are more underneath the plan stage, and then infrastructure is more in the enjoyment stage. So they found that those environmental factors were more closely related to those stages. That's not to say that that those elements weren't throughout, but it was just a stronger relationship. Some of those conditions were things like weather, physical and social barriers, and when we talk about barriers, we're also thinking about, it's not just an obstacle that stops your ability to move forward, but it's also burden. So that's the cumulative effect of conditions that will, something like, the effort that you have to put in to get somewhere, or the amount of time it's taking. So it's not just sort of these point barriers. We have to think broader than that. And again, that's thinking along the lines of a journey. And then hazards as well, and infrastructure, the typical things that we think about with accessibility, slope and cross slope and widths and distance and such. But it's very complex. Next slide. And it didn't work out properly. Okay, so in this muddled slide, it shows sort of this Venn diagram of those this ecosystem of factors, and again, it mirrors this idea of a journey. We were really interested in how these factors manifested themselves. So in terms of the context, it's why are you going to the park? Example would be camping versus a day picnic visit. So those 2 types of visits have very different expectations. As it relates to wayfinding, is it going to be difficult just to find my way around the park? Signage might help with that. Or is it going to be difficult? So wayfaring is really more about the physical experience. And then again, there's information and temporal factors, like, one time of the year, the experience is going to be very different than another, or one time in my life is going to be very different than another time in my life. And this complexity is very difficult, obviously, for a park agency to take into consideration. And again, it goes back to being able to prioritize these things, understanding how they fit into sort of a network of challenges, and being able to see things as a seamless journey, and that ultimately is what we would hope to achieve. But it has this idea of having to worry about, okay, people are going there for different reasons, and how do we incorporate that? Next slide. So in our research, what we did was we used are called geonarratives. So here we have a picture of a map where there's what I talked about in terms of those interviews. We've now put them into a GIS, a geographic information system, and we're starting to be able to look at some of the patterns that we see. So I can, in this GIS, I can turn layers off and on to see if maybe there are people who are using wheeled mobility devices that are having different patterns in their experiences. And that, again, helps to inform park management or park agencies as to maybe you need to really consider rest areas at the end of long routes. I mean, that's an obvious one, but this hopefully, this approach that we're using, hopefully we'll be able to find some more of those complex type of relationships and inform national standards in a different way than just, yes, benches should be this high, or washroom widths and lengths and stuff like that need to be certain standards. But more importantly, what are best practices? And I think that we're, as we're going through this process, we're really trying to work with people with a wide range of disabilities to be able to find some of those key elements that need to be addressed and help the parks focus on those priorities and move forward. I think some of the previous speakers talked about things like washrooms. The availability of accessible washrooms are critical. Where do you put them in the park? And this kind of approach hopefully guides those decisions to make really sound decisions that are not just knee-jerk reactions, and get incorporated into what you'll hear about in future talks, things like park policies around how you design and manage parks. Next slide. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to respond.
Thank you, Mike. I do apologize about some of the issues with your slides, so we'll definitely have those fixed in the post-production.
That's okay.
We did have some questions come in. So one was if you could give some more examples of the patterns your geonarrative research and spatial transcripts are uncovering.
Well, as I said, we're sort of early stages of collecting the data. I think one thing we found was, routes can be, again, my research is really more on the mobility area, so my focus is more on that. But as it relates to wayfinding in particular, we start to see where we have any path or trail that has more than one or two turns starts to really confuse people. And we found that we do a thing at the end of each, we do 3 routes, and at the end of each route, we ask them to point to the start of the route. And the errors in pointing to the right direction are quite large. So that pattern is more based on the sort of the windiness of those trails. And so what we, one of the things that suggested was to have something like mile markers or meter markers along a trail, so you can have that confidence that you're going in the right direction, and that you can kind of get an idea of how far away you are from your target, because most people don't understand distances either, but you can start to get a better understanding that way based just even on that. So that's one type of pattern, but we're also seeing the beginnings of differences between groups. But I kind of focus on the shared experience. I think that's really where we can really help park agencies, especially at the beginning, is really focus on those shared experiences that we're finding in those patterns across disability groups.
Right. Oh, that's fantastic. Someone else is asking for maybe a few more examples about how and where parks will begin to implement some of these findings and these kind of practical solutions like those mile markers.
Well, as we do our research, we're in constant discussions with park agencies. In Quebec, we've developed a relationship where some of these suggestions are already in the process of being implemented. Again, our project was funded to inform national park standards, just like in Toronto. And so I think every 2.5 years, they sort of take into consideration what they've learned. I was on the accessibility standards outdoor committee in the past, so I know that that's how we hopefully will be incorporated. Even collaborating with Toronto, with UBC in Toronto is another way that we're learning ways that we can move forward in that way. I also think it's not only informing national standards, but my interest is actually more of how is it going to inform like urban parks, where that's where you're more likely to actually interact. National parks, you have to have a card for almost all of them to get to, which is a major issue for people with disabilities. So if the accessibility standards thinks these things are going to trickle down, we hope to be, as the previous presenters said, proactively trying to do that. So we're in discussions with a lot of the groups, and I know with my new role as the project manager for the Accessible Organizations Project, it's going to be one of the things that I will embed into, have organizations think about embedding into their own accessibility strategy. So hopefully that will be ways that we can move those things forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Really, really important work happening. I think we have time for one more. Someone's asking how you went about collecting the narratives. Was it primarily verbally or written through an app?
It was, we had RAs walk with the person with a disability around the park. And so they were videotaped, they were asked questions, we had interpreters there for some groups, and it was just as we wheeled through, we would ask questions, we would stop, look at things. Some of them there were questions, some of them were, a lot of it was just people would start talking about their experience. And the interesting things too were their experience as it related to other experiences, because most of the people hadn't been in these parks before. And so we're basically collecting even more data that could hopefully inform those standards. But the geo-narrative, I think, ultimately is it's very novel approach that we're trying to employ, and it's going to be a learning experience even for us.
Absolutely, yeah. Fantastic, really exciting. I think that's kind of all we have time for. We have someone very interested in seeing a copy of Gemma, if as and when you guys are ready to share that work more widely.
Yeah.
So we'll collect the rest of these questions, because we do have a few more here that we don't have time for, and we'll flip those over to you. And if as and when you have time, we'll connect with you and have those answered on our Slack channel. Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. It was an absolute pleasure getting to chat to you today.
Thank you.
All right, and that kind of wraps us up for this hour. So we'll take a short break now. Our next session starts at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please use the next few minutes to take a screen break, get some fresh air, or just move your body. Thanks, and we'll see you soon. on the conference theme, What are innovative solutions to improve park accessibility for people with disabilities? On our panel today, we have Karina Kenigsberg, Tanel Bolt, Patrick Lord, Jamie McCulloch, and Noah Papazzi. Karina is the Director of Programs and Impact at Power to Be, a British Columbia-based charity that removes barriers for people living with disabilities and supports them accessing nature. Tanel is the founder of RAD Recreational Adaptive Society, whose mission is to expand the inventory of outdoor adaptive equipment available for short-term rental. Patrick leads the Outdoor Pursuits program at Prospect Human Services, which provides access to the outdoors for individuals with developmental disabilities in Alberta. Jamie is the Executive Director of Rocky Mountain Adaptive, a nonprofit organization that makes mountain sports and recreation accessible for everyone. Noah, you may remember from yesterday, was born and raised in Iqaluit, Nunavut. Noah has a rich career in broadcasting, advocacy work, and local politics. So welcome, everyone. I'll start with a round of introductions. Karina, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I am with dirty blonde curly hair and blue eyes, wearing black clothing, and coming to you from British Columbia, and specifically want to recognize the traditional territory of the WSÁNEĆ Nations that I live nearby and get to enjoy, work, and play on. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Tanel?
My name is Tanel. I am similar to Karina, dirty blonde, but straight hair, Caucasian with blue eyes. And I am also on the same territory as Karina. And I am the founder of RAD Society for short. And I'm just very, very honored to be part of this awesome panel today.
Thank you. Patrick?
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. I am a white male with blue eyes, brown hair, a little bit more gray than I like to see these days, but and wearing a black button-up shirt. Prospect and myself are located on what we call Alberta, and is the traditional and ancestral territory of many Indigenous First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So we would like to make this an acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those territories that we reside on and are visiting. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. Jamie?
Thank you very much again. And yes, super happy to be here and part of this fantastic panel today. Yeah, we come and are very privileged to play and recreate on the traditional lands of the Treaty 7 territory, which is shared with the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And yeah, I'm the co-founder and executive director of Rocky Mountain Adaptive, based in the Rocky Mountains, making all mountain sport and recreation accessible to all.
Thank you. And Noah?
Thank you, everybody, for the introduction. I appreciate it. My name's Noah Papazzi. I'm a blind user here in Iqaluit, Nunavut, born and raised here. I'm a full-time advocate after my accident. So it's been a challenging and great advocacy all around. Also, I sit on numerous organizations and former city councilor. So it's great to meet everyone. Looking forward to the conversation. Nice to meet everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, so let's dive right in. Let's start off by talking about adaptive equipment. Adaptive equipment such as all-terrain wheelchairs, hippocamp, buoyancy chairs, and audio guides are invaluable at providing access to areas that might not otherwise be accessible. But there are a lot of challenges with providing adaptive equipment at parks, such as storage, access to electricity to charge the equipment, and securing personal equipment while using the park equipment. So what are some ways that parks can overcome these challenges and successfully provide adaptive equipment for use at the parks? Tanel, I know your work with RAD Society is trying to address these challenges, so let's have you start off this discussion.
So RAD Society came up with a brain idea 3 years ago that we have called the RAD Gearbox. And this is a shipping container idea where it is renovated into an adaptive rental hub for equipment that people can share and take out for short-term use when they come to a certain place. So implementing that in parks would maybe look like a small container, 16 to 20 feet. It's fully wheelchair accessible. It is solar powered, off the grid, and full of a variety of different pieces of equipment. So equipment that resides on Vancouver Island would look much different than the equipment that shows up in Nunavut, but it would be provided in the same way. RAD is currently launching the first prototype of this in Langford, British Columbia on Vancouver Island with their Parks and Rec department to start to see the feasibility of a product like this to be delivered everywhere. And we help everybody with mobility challenges. I have yet to I don't think I'll go into somebody else's expertise and field of providing wayfinding for somebody with a visual impairment so much, but for anybody living with a physical mobility challenge, from the small kids who had a disability from a vaccine when they were 3 to the 88-year-old gentleman who had a stent put in his brain and was losing the ability to golf and is now able to move around and be supported by adaptive equipment. And it's that same piece of adaptive equipment for all ages in between. So this is the program that we came up with 3 years ago, and we're finally starting to see some fruition happen on that.
Amazing. Yeah, I really love this idea in more ways than one, and I think it has so much potential. Jamie, I know that, Rocky Mountain Adaptive, that's one of the things they do as well, is really helping people access equipment. So what are your thoughts on this?
Indeed. We, being able to provide services in this industry, we are incredibly lucky over the last 5 years in the recent history with the evolution of design of adaptive sports equipment. The variety of stuff that's becoming on the market and available, albeit while being fairly expensive, is really opening up the opportunities to be able to not only just have an experience in parks, but be able to do that on an individual's own turn relative to their own uniqueness around their mobility or cognitive functioning levels. So the solutions are coming there. In the past, challenges that I found as well is that equipment can be used on. But with some of the designs of equipment that are coming out, that in itself is curing some of the inaccessibility problems and making the trails systems and infrastructure around parks accessible due to the nature of the design of that equipment. So with that being there, and also the development of organizations like the RAD Society, Power to Be, Chris over in Kelowna, Kootenay Adaptive, there's so many coming up. So with the availability of that equipment, the organizations doing it, collaborations with parks to kind of bring everyone together. I'm really excited for the potential moving forward and the solutions we have to maximize participation in parks for individuals of all abilities, and most importantly, on the individual's own terms and relative to their goals and aspirations for being in the parks.
Absolutely. Karina, I can see you nodding along. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what's being said. I think something to think about that was quite creative that BC Parks did was they looked at their operational budget. So instead of looking at just equipment budgets or ways to modify some of their sites, they started to look at some of the infrastructure and operational budgets and started to see how they could be purchasing some adaptive equipment in potentially more remote locations. So there was a region of BC Parks up in the north in Prince George, and they were able to purchase a trail rider by using this kind of model. So it's just a creative model to look at at some pre-existing budgets you have, because Trail Riders is an example, which is a very useful tool, but doesn't offer the same independence, but they range around $10,000. So for the park sector to really think about how to utilize their budgets creatively and see maybe different areas within their budget that actually help support access and ties into infrastructure might be an angle that people would be able to start to purchase some of these equipments where you're not able to do things as independently or potentially have the benefit of, you know, a product or an opportunity like Tanel is trying to do as well.
Absolutely. I think that's some fantastic advice and sort of suggestions of ways that we can be learning from what some organizations are already doing. Noah, do you have any thoughts on some of the like adaptive equipment that's available in the north?
Thank you, everybody. Great comments, questions. I appreciate it. In reality, no, I get that'll be the truth. But at the same time, it's good to hear there's some adjustments at the same time. Where, you know, there's a building where you can, you know, borrow some equipment now. It's finally, we have that in place today, which is great. Awesome. That's a beginning of the story. And more of the story too is as well, a lot of it needs to be upgraded, especially through the beginning of the phase, where we all can, you know, connect together, you know, where individuals and workforces, you know, use these places. And most importantly, safety is number one. Safety is always a priority. So in remote places, there's animals around. And at the same time, we need to work around the animals or be respectful to the land, and as well as work with the land, really. If we work with the land, how to be more environmentally friendly, taking care of it, then we'll all work together. It'd be great.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Those are some fantastic thoughts. Patrick, do you have any thoughts on adaptive equipment and sort of overcoming some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the other panelists are definitely the experts in this area for sure. I mean, the clients and participants that we work with don't necessarily need as many adaptive equipments, but some of the clients that we are able to take on and things like that might definitely need some of that equipment as well. So it's really great to see so many new and, well, maybe not as new, but upcoming organizations that are being able to provide that for people to allow them to have that experience and to learn and enjoy the amazing parks that we have, because I think it's really, really essential for our community, especially now, to be able to get out and really have that accessibility. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think quite a few guys have touched on, Jamie, yeah, let's hear from you again.
Yeah, just one thing regarding the adaptive equipment and the relationship to the usage and promotion within our park system is, yeah, the regulators of the park, something we need to look at doing is around the policies around the equipment usage and having clarity and education and awareness around specific adaptive equipment. And as I've talked about, the great evolution in design and the impact that that can have. But yeah, there needs to be clarity on what can be used, how a certain bit of equipment is qualified as someone's mobility device. And so when someone has the access to that equipment and can use it, they're not necessarily finding people confronting them on the trail as to why are you using this? It's just a hiking trail, and having to justify this is what I need to be able to enjoy this trail in a hiking environment. So not only clarity around the policies and procedures from parks around that usage, the education and awareness to the general public as a whole as to what is being provided, and yeah, the social aspects as to why.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was some things that definitely came up in yesterday's conversations as well. And I think quite a few of you have touched on this idea of organizations and how organizations are playing a role. And that kind of leads me to this next question that, you know, already in existence are a number of organizations and agencies that help make the outdoor activities more accessible for people with disabilities, you know, through equipment, through training, through, you know, assistive help and things like this, and having the staff. So, you know, what do you think is the role for potentially for government and parks to take on stronger partnerships with these nonprofit agencies to help make parks more accessible? So, Karina, given your role in Power to Be, let's have you start off this discussion.
Sure. I think the big thing to think about is the life experience of the person. And so when people start out as children and move through different stages of life, they also experience different experiences from, you know, going to parks, going to camps, going to rec centers, being a part of their community. So a big effort that we all need to do is break the mold of those silos and really start to see where we can align in our practices around those attitudes, those approaches, and those adaptations. So work that we've done that, you know, Tanel and I have done, as well as Jamie and I, is really trying to look at how do we break that sector component and look at all of those different aspects and try and create a collaboration that not only educates around the practice side, but also where those people are going to. So we have a philosophy around people, place, and practice. And by hitting those three elements, it really does create that optimal training opportunity. So an example is our work with BC Parks and Parks Canada. And we brought in 2 other non-for-profits alongside us who have specialties around working with people with autism, as well as newcomers as well. So to really give a holistic perspective of what inclusion could look like. And all 5, 6 of our organizations co-created a workshop together where we were really targeting how do we build on that people, place, and practice components. What are those training pieces that the staff are needing to facilitate optimal experiences? What are those gaps in the training components, the gear components? And then also, how do we leverage those partnerships to be able to access equipment, to find new terrain, to look at language being a little bit altered to create more inclusive language to really support those diverse populations? And then we tailored scenarios to focus on true life situations that those park sector organizations were facing with the expertise from these other service providers. And the main thing that was really helpful too was meeting them later on to check in on how those sessions were working and how they're being implemented so that we could offer that coaching support in real life time where people could alter those practices. So I think it's really, again, just moving away from that silo and seeing opportunities to enhance those people, places, and practices.
Absolutely. That's fantastic and really exciting work to be able to do those partner training programs. Tanel, do you have anything to add with that?
It's really tough to put an accessibility lens on, say, like management plans that have already been written for the next 10 years. I find my experiences with parks is they like to plan a long time in the future. And 10 years ago, they weren't planning for accessibility. So we are not in the management plan that is currently in existence. There's an environmental lens and there's an Indigenous engagement lens. And the accessibility lens, we are trying to interject without it actually having been a thought 5 or 10 years ago. So funding is a huge, huge issue for adaptive recreation because these places and spaces don't have the accessibility that they should at this moment. Therefore, the people that are wanting to be there are not there. And when we go to apply for funding, we get asked, well, how many people are you actually helping? How many people are in these parks right now? They're not there right now. You have to put your money where your mouth is, and then they will start to come. But currently, funding is just a great big barrier. It's nice for, for me to check a box as I'm adaptive, I'm a wheelchair user, and I'm there. But to actually see that program delivery and exactly what Karina's saying, that education and that, changing the mindset and like Jamie said, changing the culture behind it. These are huge barriers, and these management plans are just coming out now for the next 10 years, and accessibility is still not a lens on them. So a hurdle is trying to figure out how to stick ourselves in there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a major barrier. Patrick, I could see you nodding along at one point.
Yeah, I think both of the other panelists, they mentioned a lot of the things that we struggle with, and I think the funding is definitely a large portion of it. I mean, we're very fortunate with the transportation aspect, and we're able to support our clients in transporting them to areas within Southern Alberta, which again, we're very fortunate, but I know that a lot of people are not able to experience different parks and locations due to that area. Like if, for example, if you're living in Calgary and getting out to Banff or Kananaskis area, you're not going to be able to be exposed to those areas if you're in a lower economic area, right? Or if you're a lower economic individual. So having the funding to be able to have organizations and provide transportation to those individuals to get out to those areas. And then when you finally do get out to the area, be with some types of professionals that are going to be able to teach you about the area and help you and guide you through navigating the parks and navigating the trail systems that you might be involved in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jamie, I know your organization works primarily within a provincial and a national park. So do you feel like there's an opportunity there for parks to have a stronger collaboration with organizations?
Mute.
Sorry, take myself off mute. I mean, I have to declare my conflict of interest here, being the leader of a non-profit organization looking to expand our outreach. Yeah, within this, trying to structure the best way of putting this politically, we're in a great stage where we are, like the awareness and education around inclusion, accessibility, and for kind of a lot of people on our panel in the recreation format is evolving. With the passing of the Accessible Canada Act, that's definitely going to help things within National Park and hopefully bridge that planning process that kind of Tanel brought up and make it more relevant as we move forward. But to achieve those targets and the lofty ambitions and like trying to incorporate all the great things that we've heard over the last 3 days, we're going to achieve that through collaboration and making sure that everyone that is interested in meeting these gaps and creating a truly accessible park system, where we can recognize everyone's strengths, the resources we have, while being cognizant of our own areas of improvement that we need to evolve and what we need to elevate that with, whether that's funding, education, awareness, or whatever. Through that collaboration piece, we can achieve incredible things. And I'll just probably finish my little talk here with a positive example. And yeah, being based in Canmore and Banff, we do have the great luxury and privilege of being able to recreate on a lot of Alberta parklands and Banff National Park. We also do programming up in Jasper National Park as well. And through the recent history, we are developing very good relationships and developing partnerships with these organizations. And already in that short time, how that's been able to increase the participation of people of all abilities in our parks has been huge. And that has to be a continued way forward because, there's a lot of people with the passions and skill sets that can contribute to this and create great environments moving forward.
Absolutely. Noah, are you seeing partnerships in Nunavut where organizations and parks are sort of collaborating to improve accessibility?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answers, everybody. Very interesting. Yes, I feel the good connection where, it's good that there's communication where we can, again, really find and connect even through, telephone. It's good that, I can be safe on my own, where I can connect with anybody. But in reality, too, as we're talking along, again, people doesn't have all these technologies. There's different ways of using technology that we use, and it can be analog, where we can use our own way of navigating ourselves. And sometimes, as for me, I'm lucky. Like, I've learned the way of the parts already before I got blind. And what actually happened was I needed to get back what I needed to get back to, which is my root. So it's very important that, respecting the people, individuals within each community in remote places. It's more importantly that we communicate better, because, up here, we use what we use and what we have. And at the same time, there's a lot of room for improvement. If we listen to each other loudly, we can connect better and help each other and create a more accessible, inclusive parks.
Absolutely. I agree fully with this. I think we'll move on to the next question now. So in many instances, making a particular park location, either the entire park itself or just a component of the park, making it accessible is overwhelmingly challenging due to environmental or historical preservation requirements. And this can include, remoteness and terrain challenges or preservation of animal habitats. And so in these cases, how do you think the parks could go about designing and creating an equivalent, meaningful experience, either through, virtual reality or 360-degree cameras, all of this sort of technology, or even exhibits located in more accessible areas? And what are some of the core components that you think would go into creating this equivalent, meaningful experience? So Noah, let's start off with your thoughts on this.
Thank you for the question. Appreciate it. Oh, exciting. Anyway, as in remote places, more exciting, I think, mobile units can be so useful up here. There's different kinds of transportation today that's being shown, especially that can be used for disability purposes, and for emergency use, and as well as for the parks. There's all-terrain vehicles that can be used across, each park, where it can be used, where they can go further in a safer manner. There's equipment within that all-terrain vehicle that can be used and learn upon, where we can learn about the environment, where we can learn, especially from each other, really, educate each other, how we can adventure and enjoy the parks together, and in respectful manner, and understanding our languages, really. And that really helps learning along the way and listening to each other loudly. That way, challenges will not be barriers when we get to that point of direction where inclusive is important, and especially, planning. Planning is important, not just for a year, maybe 10, 20 years is great.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think those are some fantastic points. Patrick, do you have any thoughts on this idea of equivalent, meaningful experiences and how parks can go about creating that for people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Noah made a really great point about including that the informational piece around those areas. If it's a historic or preservation area, the more people know and the more people are informed about why that is a historical area or preservation type area, the more that they are going to allow themselves to take part in the experience and learn more about it, so that they can become part of that community, which helps to preserve that area. And within that, you start to look at the core components about why people want to get out there, right? Like, why do people want to go out to the mountains and go hiking, or go in any areas of the park and go hiking or do whatever they would like to do? And what makes that meaningful, right? You want to be able to have that connection and experience that. And especially now, over the past 2 years, where there's so much screen time, people want to get out and feel adventurous and have that experience with the wild and sort of feel the wind on their face, so to speak, and that type of thing. So I think it's really important that in the development of new parks and areas and things like that, it's really important to institute those core surroundings of sort of all involving all of this, the senses when you are building these types of areas, because if somebody might not have the ability to see or something like that, we should have an application or a description of what that area looks like, or something like that. Like there's one trail that I went on, it's called Johnson Canyon in Banff, and there's so many people that travel on that trail, right? And so in the middle of the summer, if it's a beautiful day, you're going to be wall to wall with people, and just navigating through people as an able-bodied person, that's hard enough, let alone if you have some type of restriction or something like that. So being able to have maybe specific times where individuals can go and experience those types of trails where they can hear the rushing water from the waterfall, or actually get close enough to the waterfall rather than navigating through 100 people, so that they can feel the water splashing off the rocks and things like that, and allowing those accessible times so that everybody can feel included and allow them to feel those experiences, I think is really important. So yeah, the large education piece is going to build that sense of community and build that sense of wilderness community, and then also being able to develop your experience around all of the senses so that people can feel the earth under their feet or whatever they might be doing, that kind of a thing. There was an individual that was on yesterday that I was listening to, or maybe the day before, and he explained that there was a trail that was an accessible trail, and they got halfway through the trail and it turned into a non-accessible trail, and so it felt them wanting more, and they weren't able to feel that sense of accomplishment, which I think is a large portion of when people experience the parks, is they want to feel accomplished in completing that trail, or something like that. So yeah, I think if something is going to be labeled an accessible trail, or allow that trail to be completed as it's advertised. If it's a 3-kilometer trail and only one or half of it, 50% of it is accessible, then that's selling it short, So being able to develop that area so that everybody can experience it the way that it's meant to be experienced.
Amazing. Thank you for those thoughts. Karina, I could see you nodding along. Do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I definitely echo a lot what Patrick is saying. The sensory component is so valuable, and sometimes I think that the park staff don't remember how talented they are at interpretation and at all the different ways that they already build knowledge around local flora and fauna, the indigenous cultures, and really thinking, how do you take the things that you do through those educational means at maybe booths or other interpretive programs and bring them into those spaces that maybe don't have full universal accessibility. And one of our colleagues that I work with, she lives in a chair, and she's reminded me several times that not every place needs to be completely accessible. It's really about those landmarks of experiences. And so by having, information on the local flora and fauna, or to Patrick's point, finding those times that are a little quieter, BC Parks Foundation created some space for participants from Power to Be and another organization called Canucks Autism, where they gave them the quiet hour. So they were able to access the park when it wasn't super busy. And that gave the chance for that interpretation to go a little bit deeper. So by looking at those innovative strategies to really think about, again, can you have tactile things that people can touch, feel, smell, listen to, and I would say the experts are the ones that are the park staff doing that incredible interpretation programs. And how do you bring those into the places that have that natural heritage, that maybe they can't go up to the top of the lighthouse, but they may be able to experience what the rope feels like, or potentially the smell of the ocean, or other components that are connected to those natural spaces and places.
Amazing. Thank you. Jamie, do you have any thoughts on equivalent accessible experiences where, you know, maybe the mountain is just really, really not accessible or safe for someone?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this conference has created a great base for learning. And just within this panel discussion, I want to recognize my own learning and give thanks to Noah, who at the beginning of every question is giving thanks to the question and the opportunity to answer. So thank you, Noah, for giving me that appreciation of that time to appreciate the environment I'm in and the contribution I can make. And to our amazing interpreters that are doing a phenomenal job interpreting as we go along. So thank you there. For where we're operating, like the natural environment provides so much, should we say, like environmental challenges just with the landscape of the mountainous regions. And we've kind of talked about the different aspects around some of the solutions that are already there to be able to do it. But even within the most challenging environments, there's different places. There's the valley floor that can be more accessible. There's different ways of accessing higher viewpoints. And speaking, I think, to a point that Patrick made, we just need to be able to audit those and do proper awareness around what's available and how that can be accessed to people of all abilities. And that's one of the missing elements at the moment. But again, always trying to be the optimist around things. And through my own experience in the field that we've done, as human beings, we're only limited by our own creativity. And we only need to look back at the challenging environment that the pandemic threw us and the amazing amount of innovation that came out just through dealing with that. So something that Parks can look at is, as we're trying to find solutions, it's not just us or people similar to working on this panel right now, but the more we can open up to find solutions, like open up, whether it's competitions, engagements, engaging different social enterprise, in coming together to recognize the gap and what we're trying to achieve, and broaden the reach to find those solutions, and they will come.
Yeah, I think there's so much there to learn from other areas as well, and or solutions that would be very applicable in parks if you just take a really creative viewpoint at it. Patrick, I saw your hand up, and then we'll give Tanel a chance as well. So, Patrick,
I just wanted to add that, I mean, Jamie, from the knowledge that I have about your organization, and I'm not sure who else is watching, but they do an excellent job at ensuring that there is no mountain or area that is too high or anything like that. So they work very diligently to be able to allow that and allow people to experience those types of things. So it's amazing that the work that Jamie and the other panelists are doing with the accessibility, especially on the physical side of that. So that is very excellent to see, because like I was saying before, like the experience of being out in the outdoors and experiencing the parks should be for everyone, and they do an excellent job at doing that. So just wanted to acknowledge them in that space.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Tanel, do you have any thoughts on this idea of equivalent experiences?
Not really any new ones, but I will just sort of recap. Stakeholder engagement is so key to providing these experiences to people and seeing where they truly want to go. And stakeholder engagement, to acknowledge what Noah had said previously, has to start historically with the people who have been there forever and the experiences that they have had and how they see the land that they are on developing in the future to offer these same experiences to just such the diverse group of people that has never had the opportunity to get there. The equivalent accessible experiences, like Karina said, you talk to some individuals in a wheelchair, I want to go 4 kilometers. Somebody is really okay going 400 meters and having that similar experience in their own way, in a safe environment that is really, that is being included to them. Where I like to hang out with Jamie and get to the tops of the mountains, and there are individuals that really just want to get to the shoreline on the beach. So doing the iconic experiences and talking to the Indigenous people that have been there historically, and not just Indigenous as the color of our skin, but the people who have really been there the longest, asking what are the individual desires of people. And Parks, I know from experience, has really lost their social sciences department in outreach and engagement with the people that are in the parks right now, and the people and the Canadians that want to get to the parks. Like Patrick said, or Karina, in the quiet hour, when it's not 12 tour buses and you're having to navigate an inaccessible bus on inaccessible trails, and then when you finally get there, you have 6 rows of people in front of your wheelchair and all you get to look at is the backside of a human. So yeah, all of these things put together, everybody's got very good points, and being more mindful to that stakeholder engagement and talking to the people and networking and seeing, what do you really want? We can come up with ideas all day long. I can tell you that, $10 million and we're going to go and try and do things our way, but that doesn't actually address everybody's needs.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I think that's it. Engaging people in these designing, like the design process and the planning process and stuff, really goes a long way. Oh my gosh, you guys, again, we're like running out of time. I feel like these are conversations that we could have all day long and still have so much to talk about. But I wanted to fit in one last question. The primary mandate of this conference was to gather people together that have a shared interest in improving national and provincial park accessibility, and to learn from the advancements others have been making as well. So in that vein, is there a park or a park experience you can speak to that really nailed accessibility? Like they had a fantastic accessible resource, they had great equipment rental, or like an amazing multi-sensory trail. If you can share kind of an example of where you've seen accessibility really, really be successful, I think that would be amazing for everyone to learn from. So Tanel, let's throw it back to you to start with, and then we'll go around.
I don't know, in my dreams.
Fair.
I would say, Rocky Mountain Adaptive, Jamie and Canmore, he is the one that provides the most independent access to the places that I wanted to reach after my spinal cord injury. I found RMA very early on. Full disclosure, Jamie was my downhill ski coach for a while, and the very first person that ever let me take a hand cycle away from him and use it. So the inception of the RAD idea did come from RMA, and yeah, it's in my dreams. If somebody else knows of anywhere, I will go there and visit it.
Absolutely. Well, let's hear from Noah next. If you've had an experience you felt really nailed accessibility.
Sorry, what I experienced here now than before. In reality, I've been to the West, Calgary, Alberta, those area. I really, I really enjoyed the accessibility information challenges as well, and being on my own, and bringing it here has created a positive impact for everybody, not just for I. It's good to learn from each other. More positive we think, the better. And, it's good to connect with Rocky Mountain, and more the better. And further they go, more we engage, the better. I think it's the challenge is how we can educate each other. So it's great. And more importantly, to work with educators such as young users, youth challenges, and as well with adults. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Noah. Jamie, yeah.
Again, looking at the interpretation of providing an answer in the most optimistic way, I very much look forward to the 10th annual version of this conference and being asked the same question and being able to reel off lots of examples of the perfect experience due to the application and learnings that have been implemented from such conferences like this. The best I can do at the moment is just give snippets of little parts, which if all came together everywhere would create incredible environments. But I remember traveling just nothing to do with an adaptive realm, but just on a family holiday over to Vancouver Island. And I was at Tribune Bay Provincial Park on Hornby Island. Yeah, there was a nice gravel, hard packed pathway down to this incredible, beautiful beach. And went to use the washroom after traveling there. There was 4 washroom options. Every single one was the only options were accessible washrooms done to universal design, and it was outhouses. And like that was perfect. I was like, this is amazing. Like it's not that there's just a little afterthought or one little option for everyone. Like that was all that was on offer. That was fantastic. I have to give a massive shout out to Alberta Parks for their investment in a place, William Watson Lodge, which is down in one of their provincial parks, which provides incredible, fully inclusive and accessible accommodations in a completely outstanding wilderness setting. I'll let someone else speak, but that's fantastic.
No, that's fantastic to hear that there's things going well somewhere. Karina, let's hear from you.
Sure. I mean, I would definitely echo what's been spoken about, and Jamie's example is great. BC Parks has done an amazing job of some accessibility upgrades on Vancouver Island, a little bit north of Victoria in Rathtrevor and Parksville and Loveland Bay, and some upgrades around accessibility to the beach, the playgrounds, the bathrooms as well. There's ways to go, and I would say an example I wanted to share too is a different one, which BC Parks Foundation did, and that was really working with the traditional territory of the Shekwamik people, and they did a story trail. And that story trail always made me think of a great way to bring innovation to parks that builds on the natural history, and people could walk by posts or roll by posts, and then you would scan it and you'd hear some traditional stories of the local First Nations that are there. But it also made me think about ways that you could create integration in parks that creates, again, that universal perspective for different abilities, different cultures, different backgrounds, and really connect people to that land and build on that sense of connection and belonging. So I think we can think broader than just the modifications to make to the site, and how to also deepen that connection through different ways of integration of different tools and services.
Amazing. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Karina. And Patrick, do you have any examples?
Yeah, I mean, Jamie nailed it with the William Watson Lodge scenario. Like they have done a great job out there, and many of our clients participate in that facility. And even within our organization, we do many hikes and learning opportunities out there. I will also add that based on our organization, we try to develop employment skills, and part of that is through volunteerism. And so there's many organizations within the provincial park system within Calgary that have provided us the opportunity to go into the parks and participate in invasive species or invasive weed species or something like that, recognition and pulling, and it allows our clients to develop those skills in volunteerism, but also provide a service back to their community so that they can grow that greater sense of community through the park system and through the natural environment. So having those collaborations and partnerships where people are allowed to get involved and allowed to be accessible and inclusive, it's just amazing. And I think it just promotes a greater sense of community as a whole, and then a greater sense of connection with the natural environment and wilderness. So that's always a great experience for us.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Everyone, I cannot thank you enough for joining us today. This was a fantastic conversation, and I know that we could go on for hours. But so I'd like to thank our panel, Karina, Tanel, Patrick, Jamie, and Noah. Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion. This brings us to the end of this hour, so we're going to take a short break, and our next session will start at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. We will be starting the next session shortly. Just a reminder that Q&A links and French captions can be found in the chat. Our first speaker this hour is Lucy Diaz. Lucy is a passionate activist for accessible washrooms. She is a member of Accessible Washrooms for All and was named a Difference Maker of 2022 by the Rick Hansen Foundation. Welcome, Lucy.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to my presentation, Are Washrooms in Canada's National Parks Accessible? Let's get started. Next slide. So, who am I? I have white skin, short curly brown hair, and white glasses. I am wearing a red shirt. I use she, her pronouns. There's a picture of me on the side, but my hair is straight, and I am wearing a black shirt with a black suit jacket. My name is Lucy Diaz. I am 15 years old, and I advocate for accessibility. I do this for my sister who has cerebral palsy and some other disabilities, and I've been advocating for about 4 years now, and I have learned many things on the way. Next slide. So here's what I will be speaking about today. We'll talk about the major barriers in washrooms, what is needed to overcome those barriers. I'll give examples of places where this has been implemented in parks, and then we'll move on to a Q&A if we have any time. Next slide. There are 48 national parks in Canada, covering over 300,000 square kilometers, and over 2,000 provincial and territorial parks. These parks contain hundreds of species, incredible views, and important cultural and natural significance. All Canadians are entitled to the ability to visit these parks, but many cannot. There are many barriers to be addressed both in and out of parks, and a major barrier is the washrooms. The lack of truly accessible washrooms in parks prevents my family and so many others from enjoying the beauty our country has to offer. Thousands of people cannot go to parks because they cannot do basic bodily functions. That being said, let's get into exactly what is wrong with these washrooms. And the image on the slide is of Marine Lake and Banff National Park. Next slide. There are many barriers in washrooms, but the 4 biggest ones that I have personally seen are information, space, doors and paths, and equipment. Next slide. Let's start with information. Before going anywhere with my little sister, we must research that place extensively. However, usually there is barely any information available. And not only is there little information, but it's hard to find. I found that usually sites mention that there is a washroom, but never specify. Is the path to the washroom paved? Is it inclined? How wide are the doors? What's the turning space? This information is needed to know if the park is actually accessible for my sister. What might be accessible for one person may not be accessible for another. There is an image on the slide showing a screenshot from the accessibility page of Revelstoke National Park. All it says is washrooms without any specifications. Next slide. Another major barrier is doors. Often I found that doors are extremely heavy and without an automatic door opener. They're also very narrow, which would prevent many people from not only opening, but fitting wheelchairs through. There are also instances where paths to washroom are made of gravel, which can be very difficult to navigate in a wheelchair. They're also often on hills, which can make it even more difficult. I've experienced this so many times with my little sister having to push an extremely tall 13-year-old and a heavy wheelchair up a gravel hill is not easy. So the image is of a small washroom with an accessible washroom sign that is about 3 feet off the ground on a concrete block with no way to actually get to it. Next slide. It doesn't get any better once you're actually inside, though. Accessible washrooms are almost always too small. Wheelchairs can be very big, and you need maneuvering space, both for the wheelchair itself and for moving the person. However, there is barely enough room. And once you bring a caregiver or assistant into the equation, it's practically impossible for many people to fit inside the washroom. It also leads to sometimes having to leave wheelchairs outside the washroom or stall. I've encountered this problem so many times, and it makes life very difficult. The image shows a toilet with grab bars in a corner. Next slide. The washroom itself also lacks equipment that is very necessary for many people. The current accessible washrooms only contain a tall toilet and grab bars. This is excluding thousands of people from being able to access these washrooms and places. My sister, like so many others, needs to use a diaper, and we need a place to change her, but she no longer fits on the baby changing table. So our choices are 2. We put her on the floor of a disgusting outdoor public washroom, or we go home. And let's say we forget our dignity and my sister's fragile health and put her on the floor. Are we supposed to carry a 5'7" tall girl from her wheelchair to the floor, consistently without harming our backs and shoulders? And what if someone can stand but needs help maneuvering and needs two caregivers? When the toilet is in the corner, it does not give enough space for another caregiver to help. The image is of a toilet with grab bars, and I apologize for the almost identical pictures, but there's not much to take pictures of in the current accessible washrooms. I also want to point out that the image is of a clean washroom, and public washrooms are often extremely dirty, especially in parks, because of mud, water, and sand. Next slide. So, accessible washrooms are not actually accessible. However, disabled people deserve to be able to leave their houses and live a fulfilled life, and this includes going to parks. Without washrooms, which are made to fulfill a basic bodily function, disabled people and their families cannot go. And this is a worldwide problem that people have created solutions for. Next slide. Now, what is needed to fix these barriers? We need information online with exact information. How wide are the doors? Are the paths paved? Are they made of gravel? What equipment does a washroom have? With this information, people can gauge if the washrooms are accessible for them. Once there, if the paths are paved or made of something not that difficult to traverse, it can be accessible for many people. The door should be operable with a button, but if that is not possible, at least not too heavy and not too narrow. There should be proper equipment in place. This could include a hoist, an adult changing table, and a peninsular toilet. There are many other details that can be added for further accessibility, but for the sake of time, I can only mention these 4 things. Next slide. Many organizations have different standards for a genuinely accessible washroom. However, the most prominent, I would say, is Changing Places, which began in the UK. The standards they have include everything I covered and more. There are now many more organizations with their own standards for whatever fits a location. There are permanent changing places, but also mobile and more compact ones. Many countries have both permanent and mobile ones, but Canada only has a couple of permanent washrooms and only a couple of mobile ones, and none of those are in parks. So I'll be showing a couple images. Next slide. The first image is of a changing place, which shows a large washroom with white walls. There is a silver adult changing table on the right attached to the wall. There is a toilet with grab bars and space on both sides. Directly in front of where the camera is facing, there is a blue foldable screen that can be pulled out to give privacy. Beside the screen is a hoist. The tracks for the hoist are on the ceiling of the washroom. And finally, to the left, there is a white height-adjustable sink with a mirror above it. Next slide. The next image is of a Rise washroom. On the left, there is a picture of the inside showing a peninsular toilet with grab bars, a blue foldable screen, a height-adjustable sink, and a hoist on the ceiling. The adult changing table is not in the picture, but it's in the washroom. On the right, there is an image of the outside. It is a small blue rectangular building with a pink door. There are stairs and a ramp leading to it. Next slide. The final image is of a Mobiloo. It is a large truck with space in the back. The door is open, through which the picture shows part of the hoist and the adult changing table, as well as a toilet and sink. There are stairs as well as a lift in order to get inside the truck as it is separated from the ground. Next slide. Now let's look at how other countries have made their parks more accessible by adding a changing place or a changing place like washroom. Next slide. The UK has 1,739 registered changing places. Legislation requires all new and majorly renovated buildings to have a changing place installed. Many parks and beaches have a changing place either on site or nearby. There are also Mobiloos, which are changing place like washrooms fitted inside a truck. These washrooms can be taken to events or other areas where it can be difficult to build, like parks. There is yet another option. Rise builds transportable changing places. It's not completely mobile, but another good option. Next slide. Spain only has one, but it is at a beach. The washroom itself was outfitted into a shipping container and transported to La Playa de la Nova Icaria in Barcelona. This cambiador inclusivo, which translates to inclusive changer, allows disabled people to visit the beach without worrying that they have to go home to go to the washroom. Even if Spain only has one, this proves that it is possible to have a facility like this somewhere outdoors in nature. Next slide. Costa Rica also has cambiadores inclusivos. The Red Costarricense de Turismo Accesible, which translates to the Net of Accessible Tourism of Costa Rica, manages mobile cambiadores inclusivos, which can be found in beaches. Other countries have permanent, mobile, and temporary washrooms like Australia and Germany. Next slide. So, accessible washrooms in territorial, provincial, and national parks are not actually accessible. And there are so many individuals and families that cannot go to parks because they're denied access to a basic facility. There are solutions like changing places and Mobiloos in the UK, which would help to make parks accessible to everyone. There are many other things needed to make parks truly accessible, but washrooms are very important. Next slide. So thank you for listening. There are so many things that I wasn't able to say, but there's a lot more information online, and I believe we have time for a Q&A.
Thank you, Lucy. My goodness, that is so much fantastic research on accessible washrooms. We have a question from the audience about financial barriers and costs of these. Do you know offhand how expensive some of these options are, or maybe what the most affordable one would be?
I guess the most expensive things in the washroom would be the hoist and the adult changing table. The adult changing table, I believe, is within the range of maybe $2,000 to $5,000 for a height adjustable one. That is, there are cheaper ones if you want it to be permanently attached to the wall. And the hoist, I think, would be around $10,000. So they are kind of pricey, but it is worth it because in the long run, it provides so many more places that disabled people can go and so much more accessibility.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I was curious if those Mobiloos were perhaps a more like affordable option, being a little bit more like non-permanent.
Yeah, they are more compact and you can take them to wherever you want. I believe there are a couple, not exactly Mobiloos, but it is under a different name, but very similar in Canada. I believe it's in Ottawa, but we have pretty much none anywhere else.
Fair. I totally feel you about the state of some of the washroom floors and stuff, especially in parks where things get muddy and grimy. Have you had a chance to come across like a fantastic accessible washroom in even like a local or provincial or national park that perhaps parks could use as an example to replicate elsewhere?
I haven't found any that would work for my sister in parks at all, anywhere. I guess the closest would be in a hospital, which is made for care, but not really in parks anywhere, unfortunately.
All right, so a long way to go then. But you did share some fantastic examples in other countries, so hopefully, you know, we can be taking those and really applying them here. I have another question from someone asking if it's sort of feasible for people to bring their own slings to changing places, and would that be useful in areas that don't have power?
So yeah, you definitely bring your own slings to a changing place. Slings are something that you personally take because of size and other liability reasons. And there are mobile lifts that are not permanently attached to the ceiling, but they can be transported to a washroom and then taken elsewhere for charging during the day or at the end of the day. So there are other options other than a ceiling where it has to have power.
That could be a good option for parks that don't necessarily have good consistent access for power or any access for power. If park staff can deliver it in the morning fully charged and then pick it up in the evening and take it somewhere else to be charged, that could be like a really great option.
Definitely. It's amazing. There's a lot of different options to create a truly accessible park. You don't have to just go with one specific thing.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for this research. I think what we'll do at this stage is collect the rest of the questions because I do see them coming in. And we'll send those off to you to have you answer for our Slack channel.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lucy. It was fantastic to have you here today.
Fantastic to be here.
We'll just take a second for our interpreters to swap out. Our next speakers are Simon Darcy and Tracy Dixon. Simon is a professor of social inclusion in the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. Over his career, he has research, contributed, policy development, and advocated for improved access and inclusion in the natural environment. Tracy is an associate professor of event and tourism management at the University of Canberra in Australia. His research has focused on minimizing the physical risks of being outdoors while maximizing the health and well-being benefits. Simon is presenting first through a pre-recorded talk, and then we'll welcome Tracy. Welcome, Simon and Tracy.
Hi, my name's Simon Darcy. I'm a professor of social inclusion at the UTS Business School, University of Technology, Sydney, and am the co-investigator with Tracy Dixon, who's doing the main presentation. I've got 90 seconds. The Australian context around environmental planning and natural areas is one that goes back to our Australian Constitution, where the environment really wasn't thought about much at the beginning of the 20th century. So the whole Constitution in itself leaves the environment out. So the environment in Australia is dealt with largely under state, which is similar to your provinces, and hence can be a little different moving from state to state. However, we have had a Disability Discrimination Act since 1992, and I congratulate the Canadian government on moving forward on this very important area in Canada. In Australia, under the Disability Discrimination Act and the New South Wales implementation of it, I was part of the Disability Council of New South Wales when we brought in what was called the Inclusion Act 2014. And this placed on the agenda the importance of disability inclusion action plans by all levels of government and the way that they are implemented. It took it from being left out, omitted, or othered by various groups to making it a required inclusion that had to go beyond just being a compliance base. Hence, best practice in this space, and we believe we're part of that best practice, is developing co-design processes so that there is true and authentic consultation that sometimes brings with it an uncomfortable truth for the organisations involved. I would suggest that most natural resource-based parks organisations have a clash of cultures between resource management and a new developing culture around social sciences and the engagement of all stakeholder groups that are involved. So this is why it's important. It's on the agenda, and it's far more important now to make sure that any investment in this area is appropriate, effective, and efficient from a public policy perspective. I will now hand over to Tracy Dixon to present the rest of the story from a theoretical and an empirical perspective. Thank you. I do note that I forgot to say why the background photo was so important. These are beach environments. This beach environment, while in the metropolitan area of Sydney, extends into a marine reserve, and that marine reserve is used by an organisation called the Sargood Foundation for undertaking a variety of engagements by people with high-level disability and spinal cord injury, similar to myself, who I didn't identify as a person with a disability in the earlier part of the recording. So this space and place are being tested for the boundaries of what had been considered activities appropriate for people with high-level disability. So within this precinct, we are seeing everything from getting back into the ocean pool to doing snorkeling and scuba diving licenses, through to the ultimate engagement in the water of getting people back surfing in the adaptive surfing movement. Thank you again. Hi, my name's Simon Darcy.
Thank you for the opportunity to present on this policy development that Simon and I were involved in. You'll note that Simon can't work out what 90 seconds is. As we start, Simon and I wish to acknowledge the Monero Narigo and the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which we live and upon whose shoulders we stand, and to all First Nations of the lands of those who are listening to this presentation. We acknowledge their and your continuing connection to land, skies and water, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, please. Building upon Simon's comments, federally in Australia, the disability action plans have been required since 1992, while in the state that we live in, New South Wales, public authorities have been required to have a disability inclusion action plan since 2015. Next slide, please. And next slide. Previously, I was a member and chair of the New South Wales Ministers Advisory Council for One Public Authority. In 2017, we were asked to provide some input as they began to develop their Disability and Inclusion Action Plan. As the presentation started, it was clear that the work that we had done years ago on the Alpine Accessible Tourism Project in partnership with Disabled Winter Sport Australia, nearly a decade earlier, may be of help, and so it was. This aim of the Alpine Accessible Tourism Project was to develop summer accessible tourism opportunities in and around Australian alpine areas, yes we do have some, but leverage off the good work done by DWA in partnership with the resorts for nearly 3 decades. Next slide, please. During my 6 years on council, I kept prompting about accessibility in all protected area plans, and Lucy, you'll be pleased to know that included toilets. In March 2021, I was approached about a consultation process on a draft accessibility policy. With Simon, we devised a great 2-day residential conference at Sargood. Only COVID wanted to be invited too. And so we moved to online. While it was incredibly challenging for all, just as is happening here, it also had benefits. Next slide, please. In consultation with the staff, we defined 4 key objectives for the workshops: inform policy, develop relationships, build internal capacity, and consider how to keep the conversation going. Next slide, please. Representation was invited from across 5 dimensions of access, from advocacy groups, disability service providers, disability activity groups, access consultants, and carer groups. Simon and I were very clear that it was essential for the internal stakeholders to be listeners and to avoid trying to defend what may have occurred before. Next slide, thanks. The guiding principles for the workshop were evidence-based, solution-focused, and co-creation. It was no good if all we did was to tell the organisation what was wrong, if we weren't able to provide evidence-based solutions. And over the last couple of days, there have been many comments made around the solutions. To help everyone have a similar theoretical understanding, we briefly presented 5 key theories or concepts that I'll touch on now. Next slide, please. The first was the socio-ecological framework. It's a reminder of the different layers where change may need to occur and or where change has already occurred that may leverage more change. So at the macro level, you've got the society as a whole, the political economy, the social, the technological. The meso is the parts of society, so community groups, organisations, and then the macro in the middle is the actions of individuals, including support network for people with disabilities, such as adaptive sports organisations. Next slide, please. The second model we drew upon was from Pine and Gilmore's 1999 Harvard Business Review article on the experience economy. And we've heard various comments over the last couple of days about the visitor's experience. They suggested we have moved from a commodities economy to goods, then services, and now an experience economy. In 2012, Simon and I had taken their model and added a dimension of access that related to how independent the traveller may be, resulting in 3 continuums of active versus passive, absorption to immersion, and independence to dependence. And the question is, who visits national parks and why? And there have been, again, various comments about why people visit national parks. Next slide, please. We drew upon Simon and Buhalis's conceptualisation of accessible tourism, particularly independence, equity, and dignity. We also drew upon work by Simon and I around the idea of the whole of life participation and all those groups that would benefit from accessibility. And that was touched on in the panel just previously, where, looking at people from, birth to senior citizenship. We noted the difference between accessibility and inclusion, but acknowledged that the latter would need to be addressed later on. So the focus of the workshops was purely on accessibility, not on inclusion. That was to be a later activity. Next slide, please. The fourth related to the matrix with 5 dimensions: mobility, vision, learning, cognitive, and mental health, and 5 senses: hearing, smell, taste, touch, and vision. This highlights the complexity of the lived and embodied experiences of people with access needs, that remembering that many may have hidden access needs. With infinite combinations, it is difficult to have specific products, services, or experiences that would meet all these needs. And again, over the last few days, we've heard about the importance of information so people can make a decision upon their own needs. Next slide, please. Another idea was around the travel chain and service touch points. And I asked you to consider who is the person travelling, and then how is accessibility addressed across their journey, such as why are they travelling, their planning process, how easy it is to book their travel, how they travel to the destination, then multi-sensory experiences at the destination. At each stage of the chain, there is a service touch point and probably many partners in providing their journey. And we encourage them to think about who their partners were along the way, both on and off park. Next slide, please. After the first workshop, participants were tasked with consulting with their own stakeholders about the good, the bad, and the ugly experiences of accessing protected areas. Simon and I coded them into themes. What was interesting was that the stakeholders identified gaps across the whole of the travel chain, including societal attitudes, suitable pre-travel information, quality accessible experiences, trail designs, trailhead access, and the unintended consequences from repair, maintenance, and redevelopment. It was particularly important in this process for internal stakeholders to sit and listen and not to defend. Next slide, please. Next, we move from problems to possible solutions. These solutions provided by our participants to overcome the barriers they had previously identified may be summarised under 2 categories: providing accurate information and consultation. Another way of putting it is effective 2-way communication. Next slide, please. In the final workshop, we returned to the focus back to the policy development and implementation. This including showing this temporal extension of the socio-ecological framework, or the TESIF. Basically, what we're suggesting is to think of when and how change occurs across each layer of the socio-ecological framework when you're planning for change, from the intra and interpersonal, organisational, community, and public policy. Effective change doesn't always happen at once. It's staggered and often messy. Next slide, please. As you will be aware, there are many terms that may be used in the accessibility and disability space, some of which move in and out of fashion. Rather than telling them specific definitions, we generated a list that needed to be defined for this organisation, for this policy at this time. This list may change in the future. Next slide, please. Then in terms of embedding accessibility into the organisational policies, processes and culture, we suggested that accessibility should not be siloed off into some department or organisational unit. It should be everyone's responsibility. Accessibility should be business as usual for all. Next slide, please. The final aspect was to provide some steps for moving forward. A policy is only good as its implementation. As Simon reminded us at the beginning, policy needs to be appropriate, effective, and efficient. We don't want to be constrained by the limits of the experience and imaginations of those writing policies. We want to provide the best information so that all can achieve our own dreams and reap the benefits of being in our protected and natural areas. Then for those people here who lead small, micro, charitable and not-for-profits, I would encourage you to have a succession plan so that your vision continues beyond your involvement and leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. That was fantastic to hear about the research happening in Australia at the moment. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for questions, but we'll gather up the questions that we did get and we'll send them over to you and Simon to respond to later.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll just give a moment for our interpreters to swap out. Our third speaker this hour is Julie Nowak. Julie is a multiply disabled educator, activist, writer, and consultant. Her work focuses on the intersection of disability justice, nature connection, body liberation, and food justice through her project called The Seasonal Body. Julie has provided us with a pre-recorded talk, which we are so happy to share with everyone today. Welcome, Julie.
Welcome to this presentation about virtual park accessibility, pre-recorded for the Parks Accessibility Conference. I'm going to share my screen now with you so that you can see my slideshow presentation. So this slide is titled Virtual Park Accessibility with Julie Nowak, that's me. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns, and I am the founder of The Seasonal Body. And this slide is pale yellow text on a black background with a thin horizontal green line through the center. And a description of myself, I'm a white person with short brown hair. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and I'm in front of a white door on one side and a blue wall on the other. This next slide is titled Access Statement on the left, which is black text on pale yellow background, and on the right is the reverse colors, pale yellow text on a black background with a little decorative horizontal green line underneath the text. And all the slides after this have the same color scheme. So on the right here are some points about access that I want to share with you for participating in this session. So the first is that there are captions available, whether you are participating live or watch the recording. I'm going to try to include spoken descriptions of visual content, so that includes describing slides. I am going to try to use clear verbal communication and define complicated terms and not speak too quickly, though of course you can rewatch this later if you miss anything. And I've also created a document that's being shared with you that will include links and resources and access to this slideshow, so you'll have all the information. And when you get access to this slide, there are some hyperlinks within the slides. So anywhere you see an underlined word in the slides, that's hyperlinked. And all of those hyperlinks are also included in the document. So next, this slide says agenda, and on the right, just a short outline of this short presentation. First is this introduction, which has included the access statement, now the agenda. Then I will talk about who I am and give a land acknowledgement. I'm then going to briefly talk about two important frameworks for talking about virtual nature connection. I will then give examples of virtual park accessibility. I will give a conclusion and then share my contact info. This next slide says, who am I? And it says my name, Julie Nowak, and my pronouns, she or they. On the right are some points about me. I'm a multiply disabled person. I'm mostly homebound due to chronic illness. And so accessing nature remotely is a big passion of mine and why I want to talk about it today. I am an educator, activist, and consultant. I am the founder of a project called The Seasonal Body, which is focused on the intersection of disability justice, nature connection, body liberation, and food justice. And more information about me can be found in the resource document. This next slide says, parks are stolen Indigenous land, a land acknowledgement and call to action. And I'm including this because when we're talking about who has access to parks, So often it's not the Indigenous people whose land it was stolen to create those parks. So talking about park accessibility has to include talking about decolonizing, which literally means giving land back to Indigenous people. In terms of the land where I'm coming to you from, I'm near Toronto, which is the Mohawk word where the name Toronto comes from. This is the land of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabeg, including the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I invite all of us as part of our nature accessibility efforts to support Indigenous land return through the Land Back movement. You can learn more about who the Indigenous people are in your area at this website, native-land.ca. And in the resource document, I've included some resources about Land Back and supporting Indigenous sovereignty. This next slide says virtual nature important framework. So this is going to be brief due to time. I've included more info and links in the document about these two important frameworks, but I am going to define them for us to move forward in talking about virtual nature accessibility. So on the right, the first one I want to define is disability justice, which some may not realize is a different framework than disability rights. Disability justice is specifically focused on being intersectional, which means not just focusing on disability, but also how disability relates to other identities. So that's why the disability justice movement centers disabled BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and disabled queer folks. So those under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. And it also has a clear anti-capitalist politic. It's not just trying to give people rights under the existing systems, but fully change the systems. My next definition is for accessibility, because I think my definition is a bit different than most. I define accessibility as creatively providing a variety of participation options and viewing each option as full participation and equally valuing them. And I think this last part is often missed, which is why I wanted to bring this up when we're talking about nature accessibility. I think many people would think that accessing a park remotely or virtually or in your home is not considered full participation, but I want to challenge that and equally value that as a way to connect with nature. So let's talk about examples of virtual park accessibility. On the right here, I have 5 categories. I'm going to go through one at a time with examples. On the left, I also have a note here to point out that while these are lovely examples of virtual park accessibility, they are missing key digital access options like image descriptions, audio narration, transcripts, things like that. And so as you think about how to bring more virtual park accessibility to the world, I strongly invite you to include those things. So these are the 5 categories. Number 1, virtual hikes. 2, immersive video and audio. 3, live feeds. 4, guided online workshops and nature walks. 5, podcasts and documentaries about nature. So we're going to go through each of these one by one. So first, let's talk about examples of virtual hikes. And on the right, I have 2 points about this, 2 examples. So the first is Google Maps curated virtual hikes. So these are created thanks to Google Trekker cameras. They function the same way as Google Street View, where you can kind of move along the street, but it's done with a special backpacking camera, and so you can go along the hike. And the second example here uses the same thing as Google. It's just the Nature Conservancy of Canada. They've compiled these virtual hikes using Google Maps, specifically on the parks that are under their management. So I'm actually going to exit full screen now and just show you these websites. So this is the Google Maps website with some tiles that show the different hikes available. So for here, we've got, for example, Mont Blanc in France. So if I click on it, it brings up a page that says Mont Blanc, and it shows someone hiking on an ice face, and I can click explore, and it shows a map with points on it. I'll click on this one that says explore this place, has closer up more points. Not all of their maps are this detailed, but here's one, south base of Pointe La Chenelle, exploring Google Maps. And so this is more of a unique hardcore virtual hike where it's actually showing us rock climbing on the wall face. So we can actually see someone doing this. And we can, so we're on the side of a rock face. and the camera's moving around. If we look over this way, it's a beautiful snowy mountainous region. And like Street View, we can move up the rock face, and I mean, it kind of gets a little awkward in these ways, but beautiful, beautiful views. And on this website from the Nature Conservancy of Canada, if I scroll down, you can see the different parks they have that have simple virtual hikes that are a bit less extreme than the climbing a mountain, but still really lovely. So next slide is number 2, examples of immersive video and audio. So on the right, I have 2 points here about YouTube videos and podcasts. So if you look on YouTube and you search terms like nature trail, nature scene, nature sounds, you'll find so many options. So to show you an example, I've searched here on the YouTube search page, nature trail, and it's showing some virtual hikes. If I hover my pointer over it, it shows a preview of the video, and it's this is from a channel I really like on YouTube called 4K Relaxation Channel, which has like really high quality filmed outdoor hikes that are just better quality than the Google ones I showed you before. And if I scroll down, there are more videos from that channel, but also some other clips from other nice virtual hikes. And as for podcasts, there are lots of podcasts that just feature sounds recorded in nature, like no voices, just nature sounds. So this is one I like called Happy Sounds and Nature Sounds Podcast by Zebediah Rice. And as I scroll down, there are lovely titles like Thunder and Rain in an Australian Summer, Desert Dreamtime in Sound, The 7 Sacred Pools of Ohio Gulch in Maui. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Just lovely soundscapes. So next slide is examples of live feeds. So this could be video feeds or audio feeds. So on the right, I have 2 examples. The first is from an organization called Rainforest Connections, which has a free phone app where you can live stream live audio from forests around the world. This is their website, and as you can see here, they focus on illegal deforestation and animal poaching and bioacoustic monitoring, which they do by having microphones set up in remote forests all around the world, and they make that available to the public, which is really lovely. Also, if you look on YouTube, if you search live nest feed, you'll find live cams, feeds of birds. So here we've got one here of a bald eagle live nest cam. We've got a white stork nest live cam, and then Czech Republic. So those are fun to check up on. Next, here we've got number 4, examples of guided online workshops and nature walks. So this is more in the area of like human facilitated or educational type work. So the first thing here is virtual nature therapy walks, which are done on Zoom. In this example, they're done by guides who are certified by the Association for Nature and Forest Therapy, ANFT. So I'll show you their website here. So if I scroll down, it has some profiles for remotely guided forest therapy walks. So there are like dates and times and prices. Some of them are free as well, where they actually give you nature therapy activities over Zoom. And the other point on here is an example of like more educational webinars. In this case from an organization called LEAF, which stands for Local Enhancement and Appreciation of Forests, which is in the Toronto area, and they offer virtual presentations, workshops, and tree tours, including on YouTube. This is their YouTube page. You can see they have videos here of, for example, Virtual Lake Wilcox Park Tree Tour, and I've attended some of these and like learned a lot about tree facts and how to identify trees. They're really lovely. So number 5 here is the last category, examples of podcasts and documentaries about nature. So these are like more narrative driven. They're not just like visuals and sounds, but actually like telling stories. So the first point here on the right is a documentary series I really love called Our Planet. It's on Netflix, but they've also made it more freely available on YouTube. So I'll show you here. This is the YouTube playlist for the Netflix Our Planet series. You can watch all the episodes there. They're really great. The next point here is about podcasts. There are tons that tell stories about nature or people's experiences in nature. This is one I like called Out There that does that. I will also share that I have my own upcoming podcast. that will feature nature connection activities. The tentative name is Homeward Nature. It's not yet released, but if you follow me through the contact information I'm about to share, you'll find out when it's ready to go. So as a conclusion, I want to share that in this slide, some points here that I hope this has shown you that there are many options to creatively offer virtual park accessibility, and I hope you will join me in prioritizing disabled folks who are homebound and who can't travel when we're talking about making parks more accessible. And also just to say that virtual and indoor nature connection, they have many health benefits. Some of them overlap with the benefits you get when you're outside. And so I don't want us to deprioritize those or decenter those. Let's say they are full participation as well. And this last page is my contact info. For me, Julie Nowak, I have my social media handles here. On Facebook and Twitter, I'm at Seasonal Body. On Instagram, I'm at The Seasonal Body. My website is seasonalbody.org. My email address is seasonalbody@gmail.com. And I welcome questions or feedback. If you would like to support my work financially or even just follow what I'm up to, I'm a low-income disabled person. So if you would like to support me in that way, you can do so on Patreon at patreon.com/seasonalbody. I also take donations on PayPal. My page is paypal.me/seasonalbody. And all this information is shared in the resource document. So I will end that here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. That was fantastic. We will have Julie's reference document up on our website in the next day or two so that everyone can go check out the links and the resources that she was talking about. And questions to Julie can be posted on our Slack channel. With that, that brings us to the end of this hour. Our next session will start at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please use the next few minutes to have a break, get some fresh air, and we'll see you all again soon. Welcome back, everyone. This is the final session not only for today, but for the entire conference. Just a reminder, information about how to submit questions and how to access the French captions can be found in the chat. Our first speaker this hour is David Ostro. David has 20 years of experience in various roles with the Disability Foundation and its 6 affiliate charities, including developing the Trail Rider, a unique assistive device for adaptive hiking. David has been integral in helping turn the Trail Rider into a social venture of the BC Mobility Opportunities Society and bringing it to communities around the world. Welcome, David.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining me today. As Allison said, my name is David Ostro. I'm a white male in my 60s. What's left of my hair is very short, and I wear glasses. I'm speaking today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'm a part of the BC Mobility Opportunity Society, BC MOS, as we call it, which was established in 1988 with a mission of offering opportunities for people with mobility challenges to be active and pursue interests, largely outdoors, but actually since COVID, we've also incorporated quite a few virtual activities into our programs. Next slide, please. Basically, we now have over 30 years of experience offering a range of activities, including adaptive hiking, which has been made possible and popular thanks to the Trail Rider, which is a mobility device that we created and have shared through our social enterprise with people and organizations around the world. When we talk about innovative solutions to improve park accessibility, the Trail Rider is a big one and will help many people experience the wonders of Canada's national parks in inclusive groups and just in a wonderful supportive way. Through our programs here in Vancouver, we've explored the various wilderness areas and parks in the region. We've had also many enthusiastic outdoors types who have taken the Trail Rider to destinations around the world. And I'll share some examples of that in some slides a little bit later. I should mention that BC MOS is affiliated with 6 other charities, all of which were established by Sam Sullivan. Next slide, please. You may remember Sam. He was the mayor of Vancouver for 3 years. And the photo that you see here was just a couple of months after he was elected mayor of Vancouver. One of his first official duties was to travel to Italy and accept the Olympic flag at the 2006 Turin Games so that he could bring it back home to Vancouver for our 2010 Games. And next slide, please. Sam's visionary leadership and innovative ideas came to a culmination in a lot of ways. Before becoming mayor, he, in addition to the 7 charities he created, Sam was himself responsible for a number of innovative solutions, including one day in 1995 when he decided he wanted to go on a real hike. And he talked to a volunteer from our Tetra Society, which is our organization that recruits volunteer engineers and inventors to design and build customized assistive devices for people with disabilities. And this is actually a scan of the sketch that Sam made on a napkin while meeting with that volunteer in 1995. And as you'll see, next slide, please, what this volunteer, Paul Chermak, came up with is the original Trail Rider. Sam wasn't always a patient, or probably still isn't, a patient person. So when Paul asked him when he wanted to go on this hike, he said, "Oh, on the weekend will be fine." And so the very inventive person that Paul Chermak was found a lawn chaise in his garage, welded on a wheel and some supports, and Sam took his first hike. And the success of that led to it being developed, and obviously some improvements to make it easier to operate, etc. Resulted actually, next slide, please. Over the years, we subjected the Trail Rider to several redesigns and enhancements, and the result is the sophisticated piece of equipment that it is today. The photo that you see there is the model that we've actually been using now since 2006, what we refer to as our Black Diamond model. And it's very ergonomically designed, adjustable footrest, armrest, seat back. It folds up for transport, and it's become the core of not only our adaptive hiking program here in Vancouver, but through our social enterprise has been sold to people and organizations around the world. And we continue to build it right here in Vancouver. We custom build a run of them every year, and yeah, it's as I say, really made its way around. Next slide, please. With this wonderful device available, we're able here to offer a range of ways to enjoy nature, and it's a very inclusive experience. In our program here in Vancouver, people book hikes and go out with our staff and volunteers for hikes of varying lengths, different destinations around the Greater Vancouver area. In addition to individuals, we also accommodate groups of hikers, whether from organizations, care facilities, just groups of friends, and they get introduced to the trail rider at our hiking center, which is located at Pacific Spirit Park, which is a Metro Vancouver park right out near the University of British Columbia campus. And there are many ways that we've incorporated into the program to enable people to enjoy and experience adaptive hiking in the way that suits them best. Next slide, please. For example, some people book hikes and go out on their own with friends and family as their Sherpas, which is what we affectionately, or how we affectionately refer to the people that push and pull the trail rider. We, of course, offer orientation and training to people in how to operate it, safely and easily. Next slide, please. Another very popular activity are interpretive hikes, where we invite park rangers to come along on some of our hikes during the year and share their knowledge of local plants and animals and ecosystems. And much like the interpretive hikes that I've taken part in national parks, it really adds an element to connecting with nature that is very rewarding and interesting. Next slide, please. The beautiful thing about the trail rider is its single wheel makes virtually any trail accessible, whether it's narrow, got lots of rocks and roots, side slopes. In the photo you see here of the Lynn Canyon Suspension Bridge, which is actually one of our most popular destination hikes, it can even navigate that. Next slide, please. One of the key things, of course, in adaptive hiking is teamwork, and even very, very challenging destinations can be possible if you've got motivated people, and just a group that wants to accomplish something interesting together. In the photo you see here, a group of folks went to Garibaldi Lake near Whistler, which was roughly a 12-hour round trip hike. So not for everybody, but definitely for those that are building up their hiking experiences, a very rewarding destination, and even of course the trek along the way has many rewards. Next slide, please. And in addition, BC Moss has loaned trail riders to people to travel to some very exciting and challenging destinations. Got a few examples here on the slide that you'll see, and just describing them from the clockwise from the upper left. You have Bryce Canyon National Park in Utah, Machu Picchu, Yosemite National Park in California, the Grand Canyon, and once again Garibaldi Lakes Provincial Park. That was actually a group that took a 3-day backcountry camping trip. So all kinds of adventures are possible. Next slide, please. One of the most challenging destinations the trail riders accomplished has been summiting Mount Kilimanjaro, which has actually happened on several occasions. I believe at least 4 or 5 people now have used the trail rider to get to the top of Uhuru Peak, which is a little over 19,000 feet in elevation. So now in those situations, they use Tanzanian porters in a lot of cases to power the trail rider. It's obviously a very very challenging for anybody to be climbing a mountain at that altitude, and so the locals there are the ones most capable of it. Next slide, please. A couple of BC women, each in their 60s at the time, made it to the base camp of Mount Everest, and in fact even a little above, making it to a roughly 22,000 foot elevation. Next slide, please. A former BC Moss board member named Brad Jacobson and a group of friends pursued Brad's dream of hiking the West Coast Trail, which is located, of course, in one of Canada's national parks, the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. It's actually a very, very challenging trek. People have to get a permit to do it, and have to have contingency plans, or rescue contingencies, things like that. Anyway, this team did it successfully, and they even filmed their trek and turned it into a trailer, which is available on YouTube, called the Standing Spirit Project. And we're actually, Brad tragically passed away last year, and some of the people on the trek are looking now at turning that trailer into Brad's vision of a full-length documentary. And so something we're working on at the moment. Next slide, please. Here you see some of the things that Brad was able to experience along the way, included swimming in a waterfall with his friends. Next slide, please. In addition, he very much relished the quiet moments of contemplation and communing with nature. And here he is looking out at the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. So basically, I think you can see from that how where you can go is only limited by your imagination. Some of the places that, and I put this slide in as for a bit of humor. I don't advocate vandalizing signs in our national parks, but someone here took the initiative to point out the presence of trail riders in Jasper, and we got a kick out of that. But at the moment, the trail riders are being used extensively in BC parks, Alberta parks, largely as a result of partnerships with not-for-profits and local organizations that help people then to access parks near those communities. In addition, not-for-profit programs across Canada and in the US have acquired trail riders. We've provided them to organizations that offer outdoor services and activities like wildlife refuges, eco tours, that kind of thing, to make experiences more inclusive and enable people with mobility limitations to take part in those activities. Many municipalities and rec centers and parks departments have acquired trail riders. So there's really just a growing list of places where adaptive hiking is being taken part in. Next slide, please. In fact, we've got a list on our website of some of the places around the world the trail rider is available. And as Allison mentioned, through our social enterprise, we've now shared the trail rider with roughly 200 organizations around the world, people and organizations. Next slide, please. One of the most successful ventures with the trail rider has been in Australia, where a fellow named David Stratton, who was an Australian and lived in Vancouver for several years, when he moved back to Australia, took his experience with the trail rider here and said, we have to have these in Australia. And he caught the ear of a fellow named John Kenwright, who was the coordinator of Access Inclusion for Parks Victoria. And together they incorporated a program of acquiring trail riders, developing a volunteer Sherpa program so that the parks will actually seek out volunteers if a person does not have friends and family of their own to power the trail rider for them. The folks at Parks Victoria will secure them for them, much like we do with our local program here. They partner with local governments and not-for-profits to manage the trail riders and keep the equipment stored and maintained. They created a trail classification system specifically for the trail riders, so that if a trail is particularly difficult, a lot of elevation gain, they'll say this is a 4 Sherpa trail. If it's nice, level, easy ground, well, then it's on, just takes 2 Sherpas, that kind of thing. And at the moment now, there are roughly 30 trail riders in the park system in Australia. Next slide, please. Basically, a lot of the benefits that that people enjoy as a result of taking part in adaptive hiking is that groups of people get to come together. Sometimes groups of friends, sometimes people who didn't know each other before, establish connections. Next slide, please. They get to share a love of the outdoors. Next slide, please. They enjoy new adventures. In the photo you see here, camping trip, also up in along the Sunshine Coast of BC. Next slide, please. They connect with nature. In this case, getting up close to some bighorn sheep is not an experience everybody gets to have during their lifetimes, but is a very exciting one. Personally, I was once almost run over by a bighorn sheep, and I don't recommend that. But anyway, it's it can be exciting to see up close. Next slide, please. People make new friends and really get to enjoy their experience together. Next slide. Families are able to be active together and take part in excursions and with the entire family. Next slide, please. Kids in particular, it's so valuable when we're able to get them out and have them take part in hikes. They respond to nature and really develop a lifelong love of the outdoors when exposed to it at an early age. And so our kids hikes and our kids adventure days that we run are very, very popular and a wonderful part of our program. Next slide, please. Of course, friends get to enjoy these destinations and these special times together and experiencing the fulfillment of connecting. Next slide, please. And basically everyone has a good time. All friends, 2-legged and 4-legged, get to enjoy the experience. Next slide, please. Even Rick Mercer has enjoyed an adaptive hike. He came to Vancouver to do a feature on Sam for his show some years ago, and Sam took him on a trail rider hike, which Rick wasn't actually prepared for. He was wearing his Italian loafers, and yeah, that was a bit of fun and some fun on that episode. Next slide, please. And basically the message that we've been promoting, as I say, for over 30 years now, is that access to nature is for everybody. Adaptive hiking is such a rewarding and inclusive experience, whether it's a short, gentle hike, of a half an hour, here in a local park, or, one of these challenging, multi-day backcountry excursions. Basically a group of people, with a trail rider can make virtually any beautiful natural place accessible. And next slide, please. And basically the camaraderie and inclusiveness that people experience is a feeling that never goes away, and really in our experience makes people want to come back again and again. And next slide, please. And that's everything I had to share with you today. Thank you very much for sharing your time with me.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. It's so great to hear that the Canadian Design Trail Rider is gaining traction in our local parks. We don't have time for questions, but we did get a few come in. So what I'll do is we'll gather those up and we'll send them over to you to answer later.
My pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll just give a minute for our interpreters to swap over. Fantastic. And our final speaker today is Marc Groulx. Marc is an associate professor at UNBC's School of Planning and Sustainability, and he is a registered professional planner. His current work includes the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council-funded Nature for All project that supports an evidence-based approach to promoting inclusive experiences in British Columbia's nature through barrier-free design. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks so much, Allison. I really appreciate the introduction, including a proper pronunciation of my last name. Before I get going today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh in Prince George, where I've been an uninvited guest since 2016. Next slide. As was mentioned, my name is Mark Grew, and I'm Associate Professor in the UNBC School of Planning and Sustainability. I am a white male, have dark brown hair, a rather long beard at the moment, and I wear glasses. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about some of the recent work I've been doing along with partners looking at the context of remote and rural outdoor tourism and recreation spaces. This work has unfolded over the past 5 years in partnership with Spinal Cord Injury BC and their Access BC initiative. The conceptual foundations I'll speak to at the beginning stem from some of Mike Oliver's work establishing the social model of disability. And after briefly discussing some of those concepts, I'll talk about the process of conducting a scoping review and share some of the insights from the work that we have done. Next slide. So the picture on this slide is of an older gentleman wearing glasses with a beard. This is Mike Oliver, a British sociologist and advocate for persons with a disability, as well as a professor of disability studies. And throughout his work in the 1980s and 1990s, Oliver was highly critical of what he saw as an inaccurate and disempowering societal view and practice of ascribing the source of a person's disability to their bodily function and its perceived deviation from some sort of and I'll use quotes, normal distribution of people in society. So he critiqued this medicalized view of disability or the medical model of disability along several lines. First, he argued that the medical model of disability stems from a problematic view that a person's inability to access certain places, like a playground or many of the spaces we just heard about from our previous presenter, stems from some sort of a missing or diminished function within a person's body, rather than a set of attitudes and designs that create spaces that include some while excluding others. He also suggested that the medical model was based in what he referred to as a theory of personal tragedy, where society unconsciously saw persons with a disability as necessarily being victims of a circumstance rather than being fully empowered individuals. Next slide. As an alternative to the medical model of disability, Oliver outlined what he first called the social oppression model of disability. Rather than disempowered victims, Oliver talked about disabled individuals as empowered actors in charge of creating and leading fulfilled lives. Rather than believing in a non-existent normal member of society, he saw population simply as involving a continuum of different functional needs over the life course and over a range of society. And rather than a person's impairment being the reason for their own exclusion, he argued, as we know, for exclusion being the predictable outcome of the creation of a society where we've made design choices based on attitudes that include some, again, while being inaccessible to others. Next slide. So as part of the Nature for All project, we were interested in exploring how some of these views on accessibility might be represented within particularly the planning, design, and management literature as it relates to outdoor, rural, and recreation spaces. So we examined this by completing a scoping review, which is a research approach that tries to answer a question not by collecting new primary data, but by looking at existing sources, in our case, academic research. And in a lot of ways, I would say that what we were doing in our scoping review was taking some of the foundational questions that Oliver asked over 40 years ago and looking back at the literature to see what we might have learned about accessibility in the context of nature-based spaces in rural and remote areas. We were particularly interested in this because we recognize at this point that nature contact is an incredible wellspring of health and well-being benefits for individuals, communities, and societies, and that everyone should have an opportunity to benefit from that wellspring. So we did this by asking a fairly straightforward review question as we looked at the literature and the research on this topic. Basically, what principles, standards, guidelines, and policies are used in the evaluation and design of accessible outdoor tourism and recreation spaces? Next slide. So when conducting a scoping review, rather than looking for and including studies in an organic fashion through something like a Google Scholar search, you set out ahead of time a whole range of rules that you follow to make sure your study is predictable and transparent. An image of the flow chart on the right of the screen here, which shows a series of cascading boxes, basically shows how we moved from capturing initially about 1,800 studies, reviewing some of those studies to identify what was going to be relevant to our question and what wasn't going to be relevant to our question. And ultimately, we got down to about 41 studies that included a relevant focus, which was again on accessibility in rural nature contexts, a setting, which was rural and remote outside of the urban environment in particular, and a focus on a population, which included folks with a disability, but we are also interested in benefits that we know accrue for many, many members of society who benefit from accessibility. Next slide. So speaking to the theme, I think of this section of the conference around solutions. One of the things that we are interested in is what the starting point for some of those solutions might be in terms of how the literature is conceptualizing accessibility or barrier-free access in rural and remote nature. Next slide. We developed a diagram shown on the screen here, and again in 3 slides, which is a map of the key concepts that are shown as bubbles in this diagram, connected with some lines and arrows. To identify how the literature and how researchers are thinking about accessibility in remote and rural spaces. I won't try and describe all of the relationships that are captured here, but I do want to draw your attention to the fact that the diagram has the social model of disability as a prominent, although by no means universal approach to thinking about accessibility in outdoor spaces. There was, with this, quite a widespread recognition and discussion of some of the societal barriers that might limit outdoor access in tourism and recreation spaces, capturing, I think, many of the discussions that I've heard over the course of this conference so far. And these ranged from physical limitations like the design of trails and washrooms, but also a recognition of some of the things that folks in the conference have talked about, like the design and delivery of interpretive programming that relies fully on the visual consumption of nature while leaving out those who might have a different sensory experience of natural environments. Next slide. Participation in nature, and particularly the ability to be self-determining in this pursuit, was given as the core objective of accessibility work. So in this sense, I think the literature is in line with many of the folks who I've had a chance to hear from at this conference. And while this aligns closely with Oliver's original work and much other research on accessibility, the specifics of the importance of accessibility in nature spaces did emerge in more recent literature, where scholars have looked at accessibility not only as a matter of health equity, but specifically as a matter of equitable access to the type of nature contact that the first speaker spoke to and the benefits that can accrue from this nature contact. So drawing on one of the scholars, Ringolan and colleagues, this suggests that those involved in the management of spaces that hold these health-related ecosystem services or benefits, like our national parks, should have regard for accessibility as a matter of social inclusion, but also as a potential driver of, and I quote these authors here, a disparity in health outcomes that is caused by social or economic disadvantage that has their roots in poverty and discrimination. Next slide. So as a team of planners and public health researchers, and I think again relevant to the theme of this session, we were interested also in what the literature said about accessibility and the types of solution pathways that were envisioned for rural and remote nature. Next slide. Looking again at that concept diagram, linking some of the concepts used in the literature, we could see that if participation and self-determination is the normative or desired goal for accessibility, the literature presently identifies or conceptualizes 3 solution pathways to being able to enable that participation. All of those informed or directed at overcoming barriers that individuals might face along with their families and potentially their caregivers. Next slide. So the first of these pathways focuses on the solution of personal adaptation, overcoming barriers through potential behavioral changes, often incorporating different supportive or adaptive technologies. This is, I think, demonstrated well over the course of this conference, and again on the screen here, in terms of the individuals using an adaptive mountain bike in a forested setting. One of the things that this pathway acknowledges, or that research examining it acknowledges, is that there's a capacity for benefit to having personal challenge, growth, and empowerment through being able to use supportive technology to tackle more challenging environments. But the literature also talks about or highlights the equity issues that can come with this, particularly in terms of the disproportionate burdens, often time and finances, that might come with the requirement to access adaptive technologies. And very exciting to hear about a lot of the work that's happening through this conference to overcome some of these potential equity issues. Next slide. The second path that the literature identifies or refers to what we have termed as structural accommodation. So this path emphasizes structural changes, often to a physical environment, sometimes identifying the need to make changes in service environments, but in this case directed only at a certain segment of the population. So the pathway identifies the need to reduce burdens and promote full and equal participation. But in this case, scholars and research identifies fairly clear equity issues involved in creating structural accommodations that create a group of other users or visitors. So this is demonstrated here in Prince George with the image on the right of our 4-story wood innovation and design building, which, despite being one of the newest buildings built in downtown, has a staired main entrance with a separate ramped entrance for those who might have differing mobility needs. And it has been an ongoing source of discussion about doing better around universal design in our community. So finally, the last solution pathway discussed within the literature recognizes the opportunity and long-standing conversation about bringing universal design principles into remote and rural nature contexts. This is illustrated on the slide on the image on the right, which is of the accessible boardwalk set within the cedars of the ancient forest here near Prince George. And again, the focus on this pathway is not putting in place barriers to begin with and creating solutions that work for all segments of society equally. So not investing in solutions that create that set of other users or visitors. Next slide, please. So finally, maybe where we might be able to tackle most directly some of the theme around innovation and solutions. What we were really interested in as we moved through our review of the literature, especially with new legislation around accessibility at a federal and provincial level, was really any aspect of what we might be doing in the research realm to support an understanding of the development and implementation of accessibility standards in remote and rural spaces. Next slide. So we were actually quite surprised, starting with over 1,800 studies as we moved through our review, to only identify 6 studies that directly address the topic of accessibility standards. And in most cases, this involved conducting an accessibility audit of a destination using some sort of a predefined set of standards. Absent from the literature was research examining some of the collaborative work that we know is happening within processes like Canada's Federal Task Force on Accessibility Standards. Really, we weren't able to identify a focus or a strong focus on longitudinal evaluation of destinations to see if accessibility improvements are actually being made over time in remote and rural nature. And I think really importantly, we weren't able to identify any studies that have worked with folks who might have lived experience with a disability to determine whether and how implementing standards in rural nature spaces is improving a sense of inclusion and access to the well-being benefits that these spaces provide. Next slide. So my wrap up here on my conclusion slide asks a little bit about what we might learn from the state of the literature on accessibility in rural and remote nature spaces that might be relevant to the theme of innovation and solutions. So first, I think it's important to point out that there's no lack of concepts being identified within the literature related to research on accessibility, including framings like universal design that will be familiar, I think, to many at this conference. But one of the things that was noticed was that cross-fertilization with concepts from environmental planning, key discourses like ecosystem services and resilience that are very common in conservation management doesn't seem to be happening. So given that, there seems to be a need for more work exploring where these realms overlap, particularly when planning for spaces where equity and accessibility have to sit hand in hand with sustainability and conservation. Many studies either presented or recognized a prevalent view that accessibility and universal design is somehow a threat to environmental sustainability. My sense is that's a pretty antiquated and unsubstantiated view, but it seems to me that there's a lot of solutions work to do, focusing on the limitation of this attitudinal barrier in conservation management. And we need, I think, a lot more work examining how accessibility and sustainability practice can be integrated, and a lot more examples like the Ancient Forest Boardwalk and many, many other solutions that we're seeing across this conference and across BC, that show how accessibility and conservation can live hand in hand. Thanks very much for the opportunity to share, and happy to take any questions that might be arising. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was really enlightening and some really great insights there. Obviously, so much work still to be done. Unfortunately, we don't have time for live questions, but we will gather up the questions that we received and we'll flip them over to you to answer at a later time. Thank you so much, Mark. I'll just give a moment for our interpreters to swap over. And that concludes our speaker lineup today and our conference. I want to give a huge thank you to all of the speakers who shared their stories, their thoughts, their experiences, and their research with us over the last 3 days. I'd like to invite Dr. Tilak Dutta back to the stage to give some closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Allison. Yeah, wow, the past 3 days has really flown by for me. People talk about these kind of virtual events, Zoom fatigue, and not being able to engage audiences virtually. I haven't found that at all. I've been watching each of these talks where it's clear that people are invested in these talks, in what they're talking about, and about issues that they deeply care about, and that comes through, and that makes it engaging. And I don't know about the rest of the audience, but I certainly found myself very excited to hear from each of these speakers. Okay, so quick, I know we want to wrap up quickly. Just a couple of things that I would like to do before we wrap things up today. The first thing is we're going to go through some thank yous. We need to thank a number of people that have helped make this conference possible. And then I'm going to connect with the list of things that you can do to stay with us. Remember at the beginning of this conference, you might remember I said that I'm hoping that you'll see this as the beginning of a conversation on how we can make our parks more accessible. I'm going to just remind us of a few ways that we can do that, a few of the ones that I already mentioned, and one new one that I wanted to highlight as I think it's particularly important. So I'll just start with some thank yous. So first off, I want to thank our funding agency. Our funding for this conference was made possible by Accessibility Standards Canada. If you're interested in getting involved in writing standards and getting involved with them, they are regularly recruiting people for their committees that actually write these types of standards, so I suggest you get involved. In particular, we have 13 people on the slide that you see on the screen now that are part of our team that made this particular conference possible. They're arranged in 3 rows. In the top row, we have Yashoda
myself and Manjeet, Yashoda and Manjeet were responsible for the overall organization of most of the work that was involved here in getting this conference to happen. I think most of the presenters would have met with one or both of them already. Going down to the second row, we have Ziad, who is our tech person, arranged all the live YouTube streams on our website. Next, we have Melanie, who is our strongest bilingual member and in charge of all of our French writing and interpretation. Next to Melanie is Allison, who you've all met, our star MC, who did a great job as a host. Wakas is next to Allison, who is our webmaster and in charge of relaying questions. We have Neha next, who is in charge of arranging some of our interpreters. I want to say a special thank you to all of our interpreters, ASL, LSQ on screen, as well as our audio interpretation. We had French in language, French to English and vice versa, as well as English and French captioners. It's exhausting work, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Moving down to the bottom row, we have Hassan, Hamid, Hanan, and Shreya. They were involved in packing and sending out gift bags to the first 350 people who signed up for the conference. Last but not least, Mark was our team's expert on screen readers who helped make sure our materials were screen reader friendly. Okay, so then I thought it would be useful to summarize what our team felt were our 10 key takeaways that sort of were messages and ideas that came up over and over through a number of people's talks. So let's start here. Number 10, the message that I got was, that we started with here was different people have different needs, and we have to make sure our plans for parks include awareness of these different needs. And Mahadeo's talked about the need for personalized solutions. I thought Carrie and her group's innovative idea of forest bathing pods was interesting, and Karina's idea of a quiet hour were interesting ways of balancing the needs some people have for quiet spaces with other people who want more hectic environment and experiences. Some of the specialized adaptive equipment that we heard about in our panel today with the Trail Rider and some of the other adaptive equipment that we heard about offers similar abilities to get people with different needs what they want. Virtual park experiences are yet another way that we can do some of these things. Number 9, role models are important. As Minu noted in her talk, sharing examples of people like Lawrence Gunter going to parks may encourage others to try those types of things themselves. Number 8, providing more specific information about accessibility as opposed to generic labels. People want to know how wide the trail is, how big doorways are, how much space there is, and what equipment is available. Number 7, many presenters highlighted the need for a cultural shift. Many don't know, some people highlighted that a lot of people don't know what they don't know. And so we need better staff training and education. Number 6, accessibility is a moving target. We can all do better. One of the things that I'm trying to do right now is speak slowly so that our interpreters don't have a hard time. We're running a few minutes late, and I know when I get excited and stressed, I start speaking faster. I'm going to try to slow down for you. There's always ways to improve. I think Mahadeo did a great job of highlighting the different stages that as individuals or as organizations we need to think about going through until we push to get to stage 4 ultimately. Number 5, nothing about us without us. This idea came up a number of times. The need for co-design is critical. Novel research approaches might help, like the geo-narratives that Mike brought up. Number 4, we need better washrooms. I think Lucy, Julie, and Megan all made that point very clearly. Number 3, we can't really talk about accessibility without thinking about affordability. This can include the cost of entry, but also the cost of transportation. Number two, people who want to go to parks want to go to do things with their friends and families. And so we need to find ways of allowing people to do things together as much as possible. And number one, I want to circle back to what was, I think, at the core of the message that Maayan Ziv gave in her eloquent keynote, that there's a lot of good reason to be optimistic. Things are changing, and each of us can help make things change. So I hope you'll all stay involved in this conversation that we've started here at this conference. I mentioned earlier, there's 4 ways you can be involved. You can email or call us to share your perspective if you haven't found a way to share it yet. We have this crowdsourced A to Z accessibility book that we want to put together with your help. We want you to fill in our survey if you haven't done that yet, if you're a person with a disability or a caregiver. And consider joining our discussion forum on Slack. I've noticed there's already some interesting posts happening there. Craig posted from BC Parks about another conference that we'll be running in December. Please check it out. The one new point that I wanted to make was has to do with the draft standard that will be coming out from Accessibility Standards Canada. I just learned that this draft standard should be out for public review in early 2023. And so we're going to keep an eye out for that, and we'll let you know through our forums or through email. And it's really a valuable opportunity for all of us to look at what the standard includes and to write in what it's missing and to make suggestions. I think, certainly not all of our suggestions will make it in, but it will be hard for the committee to ignore ideas if they come up over and over. So I think that's one of the highest value things that we can do as a community, is keep an eye out for that public review and send in our recommendations. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I personally learned a ton over the past few days. I really just want to thank you for being here with us and for sharing so openly about all of these important issues. We will be running this conference again next year. If you have suggestions on how we can improve it, we'd love to hear from you. So I hope to hear from you all soon. Thank you. Back to you, Allison.
Thank you, Tilak. Just to echo Tilak's words, thank you again to all the wonderful speakers we had this week. This has truly been an honor to be part of this event and to hear all the stories that were shared. And to thank you to our attendees. Your participation and presence has been felt so strongly, even through these virtual platforms. So thank you for being here. The conversations do not end today. Please head to our website and check out the links to our dedicated Slack channel, where you can connect with speakers and other attendees. If you are not able to see all of the speakers or all of the days, please head to our website. We will be adding the recordings to the website and the YouTube channel. As soon as we finish post-production edits on today's recording, that will get posted as well. And please do not hesitate to get in touch with us with your concerns, your feedback, your questions. We love to hear from everyone. Thank you all again so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day.